Hello, and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. In the very early hours of the 1st of April in the year 1572, a fleet of some 24 small, battered, leaking ships, crewed by roughly 600 men who had spent the better part of a year as fugitives with no country willing to shelter them, no king willing to pay them, and no port willing to feed them, drifted out of the mouth of the River Mass and found themselves, more by accident than by any grand strategy, sitting off a small, poorly defended, half-forgotten Dutch town called Den Briel, which the English called Brielle, a town whose own garrison had been stripped down to almost nothing because its Spanish-appointed governor had marched most of his own soldiers off days earlier to help put down unrest in a neighbouring city, and the men on those ships, exiles who called themselves, with the particular defiant humour of people who have decided to wear an insult as a badge, the Guisan, the Beggars, a nickname a Spanish courtier had thrown at their own leaders in contempt 6 years earlier, rowed ashore, found the town gates unguarded and simply walked in. There was no great battle. There was, by most surviving accounts, barely any fighting at all. A handful of terrified town officials, a few shots fired into the dark, and by the time the sun came fully up over the flat, wet Zealand coastline, a ragged, half-starved, half-piratical fleet that had been sailing aimlessly from port to port for the better part of a year, looking for anywhere at all that would let them drop, anchor had, without quite intending to, captured a town, raised a flag and lit a fuse that would not finish burning for 76 more years. This whole long night belongs to the war that began, more or less, on that unremarkable morning at Brielle, and to the 76 years of fighting, negotiating, flooding, starving, and occasionally massacring one another that it would take to turn a scattering of exiled pirates and disgruntled provincial nobles into an independent republic that the greatest empire on earth would eventually be forced to recognise as a sovereign equal. It is a story this channel is not going to tell you as a clean tale of an oppressed people rising as one against a tyrant, however satisfying that version remains on the modern Dutch national holiday that still, in its own quiet way, echoes this same spring, because the truth underneath it is very considerably messier than that. A war fought less as a single national uprising than as a tangled knot of civil war, religious war and dynastic rebellion all wound together. A war in which the rebels themselves spent years bitterly divided over what, exactly, they were even fighting for. A war that would eventually and permanently split a single set of 17 provinces down the middle, producing not one liberated nation but two countries that still exist today. A Protestant north that would become the Netherlands and a Catholic south that would eventually become Belgium. Neither of them the outcome any single person involved in that morning at Brielle actually set out to build. It is a story about ordinary market towns starved to skeletons behind their own walls, about a prince who spent 20 years losing almost every battle he personally commanded and somehow still became the father of a nation, about a king 700 miles away in a stone palace outside Madrid, who genuinely believed, with real and sincere religious conviction, that God had placed the burden of these rebellious provinces on his own shoulders, specifically so that he might save their souls even as he crushed their bodies, and about the strange, slow, accidental way that a fight over noble privilege, tax policy, and the right to worship according to one's own conscience became, by the time it finally ended, the opening act of the modern idea that a people might legitimately renounce their own king. Before this story drifts any further into that long war, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe if you find these unhurried histories worth your time, and if you're watching tonight on YouTube, you'll find a link down in the description that takes you to this same episode on Spotify for creators, where new stories from this channel go up early, before they ever reach here. And if you're listening on Spotify right now instead, do the reverse and go search Historian at Midnight on YouTube, where you'll find the fuller archive waiting. And if you feel like leaving a small trace of yourself behind tonight, drop your location and your local time down in the comments, just a line, nothing more, because there is something quietly good about knowing that somewhere else in the world, in a different hour under a different sky, another tired stranger is settling into the same slow, unhurried story you are. So let the evening close in around you now, whatever hour it happens to be wherever you are. Loosen whatever you have been holding on to today. Let the mattress take your full weight. Let your jaw unclench. Let your eyes rest, even if you are not ready to let them close just yet. And let this long, low, patient voice carry you backward across 4.5 centuries to a damp, flat, waterlogged corner of northern Europe that no king in Madrid or Vienna ever expected to give him the fight of his own life, and to the 17 provinces, the exiled prince, the burned cities, the drowned fields, and the 76-year war that turned a handful of beggars on borrowed ships into a nation. A patchwork inherited, not built. To understand why a prince with one arm's worth of an army and a fleet of stateless pirates could eventually humble the empire that Spain had become by the middle of the 16th century, it helps to understand, first, exactly what kind of territory the Low Countries actually were before any of this began, because they were never, in any meaningful sense, a single country at all. The 17 provinces that made up this region, roughly corresponding today to the modern Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, along with a strip of what is now northern France, had accumulated under a single ruling family, not through conquest in any single dramatic campaign, but through nearly 2 centuries of the patient, unglamorous, and remarkably effective medieval practice of marrying well, the Dukes of Burgundy absorbing county after county, duchy after duchy, bishopric after bishopric, through inheritance, purchase, and advantageous matches, until by the early 1500s the whole patchwork had passed, through one further crucial marriage, into the hands of the Habsburg family. The same dynasty that already held Austria, Spain, large portions of Italy, and, for a time, the elected title of Holy Roman Emperor itself. A family whose own territorial holdings had grown so vast and so scattered across the map of Europe that contemporary observers genuinely struggled to describe them as anything so simple as a single empire. It is worth naming plainly exactly how little the 17 provinces actually had in common with one another beneath this single ruling house, because the differences mattered enormously to everything that followed. Flanders and Brabant in the south were densely populated, heavily urbanized, and built on centuries of cloth manufacturing and international trade, home to cities like Ghent, Bruges, and above all Antwerp, that ranked among the wealthiest and most sophisticated commercial centres anywhere in Europe. Holland and Zeeland in the north were, by contrast, still a considerably poorer and more provincial territory of fishermen, small farmers, and modest trading towns, their own economic rise into the wealth this channel has described on other nights still decades in the future. Each of these provinces, and the many smaller ones scattered between them, retained its own laws, its own governing assembly or states, its own charters of local privilege that a new ruler was expected to formally swear to uphold in a ceremony known as the Joyous Entry, a set of medieval agreements binding a prince to consult his own provincial estates before raising new taxes or altering local law, agreements that had for generations functioned as a genuine and jealously guarded check on any single ruler's own ambitions. The 17 provinces spoke, among them, both Dutch and French dialects, answered to bishops under a haphazard and centuries-old ecclesiastical map that bore no relationship whatsoever to the political boundaries drawn across the same territory, and had never, in their own history, been asked to think of themselves as a single people with a single interest, a fact that both explains why the Habsburgs could rule the region for as long as they did without provoking outright revolt, and why, once revolt finally came, it proved so agonizingly difficult for the rebels themselves to hold together, It is worth naming too exactly how far that wealth in the southern cities translated into real local political power long before this war ever began, because the guilds of weavers, fullers, and dyers who ran the textile trade in towns like Ghent and Ypres had, across the medieval centuries, repeatedly asserted a genuine independence from their own nominal Burgundian overlords that few other parts of Europe could match. Urban populations organised into guilds powerful enough to elect their own city governments, resist noble taxation, and, on more than one occasion across the 14th and 15th centuries, rise in open-armed revolt against their own dukes long before Philip II was ever born. A tradition of urban, artisan-led defiance of centralised authority that this war would draw on directly, because the same dense, closely packed, politically self-confident guild culture that had produced medieval Flemish rebellions against Burgundian dukes proved 2 centuries later remarkably fertile ground for the spread of Calvinism's own considerably more radical challenge to established religious authority as well. It is worth naming too the deeper intellectual soil this same region had already cultivated long before Luther ever nailed anything to a door, because the Low Countries had produced, across the 15th century, a genuinely influential tradition of lay religious reform known as the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion, a movement centred on communities like the Brethren of the Common Life that emphasised personal piety, plain devotional literature written in the common tongue rather than Latin, and a certain impatience with the wealth and formality of the established church hierarchy, a tradition that produced, among many others, the great Christian humanist scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, whose own biting satirical criticism of clerical corruption and whose own insistence on returning to the plain text of Scripture, though Erasmus himself never broke from the Catholic Church and died deploring the violence Luther's own reform had unleashed, had already primed a considerable portion of the Low Countries' own literate population, decades before Calvin's own theology arrived from Geneva, to receive a message of religious reform with rather less shock and rather more sympathy than it met in many other parts of Catholic Europe. It is worth naming too the man who actually ruled this patchwork for the first half of the 16th century, the Emperor Charles V, because Charles occupies a genuinely unusual place in the memory of the Low Countries even today, remembered there with a fondness his own son would never come close to earning. Charles had been born in Ghent in 1499, raised largely in the Low Countries under Burgundian court customs before he ever set foot in Spain, and he spoke Dutch and French as naturally as Spanish, a native son of these provinces in a way that mattered enormously to how his own rule there was received. And although Charles's own reign brought its share of new taxation, religious persecution of the small early Protestant movements beginning to take root in his territories, and the same kind of centralising administrative pressure that would eventually explode under his son, Charles governed the Low Countries, on the whole, with a native's instinct for how far the province's own jealously guarded privileges could be pushed before they broke, an instinct built from having grown up inside the same local customs he was now asked to rule over. In October of 1555, in a ceremony held in the Great Hall of the Palace at Brussels that moved several of the assembled nobles to open tears, an exhausted and gout-ridden Charles, not yet even 60 years old but worn down by decades of nearly constant warfare and administration across an empire too large for any single man to govern properly, formally abdicated his rule over the Low Countries, leaning on the shoulder of a young nobleman named William of Orange as he did so. A detail contemporary chroniclers recorded and that later generations would find almost unbearably ironic once they knew what William would go on to become, and handed the 17 provinces, along with the crown of Spain and its own vast overseas empire, to his own son Philip. It is worth naming plainly the single financial inheritance that shaped nearly every decision Philip would go on to make across the whole of this war, because Charles's own decades of nearly continuous warfare against France, against the German Protestant princes, against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, had left the Spanish crown burdened with a debt so enormous that Charles himself had already been forced to default on portions of it before his own abdication, and Philip inherited, alongside the 17 provinces and the crown of Spain itself, this same crushing weight of obligation to the international banking houses of Genoa and Germany, who had financed his own father's wars, a debt that meant Philip began his own reign already searching for new revenue anywhere he could find it, a search that led directly to the same aggressive fiscal centralisation in the Low Countries this account has already described, and it is worth naming honestly that nearly every single Spanish military failure this whole story has shown you across the following 80 years, the mutiny at Antwerp, the failure to relieve towns under Dutch siege, Alba's own catastrophic 10th penny tax, traces back in the end to this same original problem inherited from Charles, an empire that looked, on paper, like the wealthiest power in the world, and that was, in the plain and unglamorous reality of its own account books, perpetually and dangerously close to broke. It is worth pausing on Philip II himself, because nearly everything that follows in this story flows from the specific character of the man who now inherited these provinces, and Philip was, in almost every way that mattered to his new subjects in the Low Countries, the precise opposite of his own father. Where Charles had been raised among the Flemish and spoke their language, Philip had been raised almost entirely in Spain, spoke Dutch not at all, and French only haltingly, and regarded the Low Countries not as a homeland but as one distant, troublesome, and expensively garrisoned province among the many that had fallen to him by inheritance, a territory he would visit only once more in the whole of his own long reign, departing in 1559 and never returning again, choosing instead to govern from far away through a chain of appointed regents and written instructions that could take weeks to arrive and weeks more to be answered. A genuinely consequential distance that meant every crisis in Brussels had to survive a round trip to Madrid before Philip's own final word on it could return. Philip was, by the near universal testimony of those who served him, a man of formidable personal industry, working long hours over mountains of paperwork with his own hand, and of equally formidable and genuinely sincere religious conviction, a devout Catholic who understood the growing spread of Protestantism throughout his own territories, not as a political inconvenience to be managed, but as a literal spiritual catastrophe, a plague upon the souls of his own subjects that he, as God's appointed sovereign, bore a personal and non-negotiable obligation to stamp out wherever it appeared, a conviction that would make Philip, across the whole of the war this story is about to describe, almost entirely incapable of the kind of pragmatic religious compromise that might, at several distinct moments, have ended the conflict decades earlier than it actually did. It is worth pausing briefly to hold one single imagined life against the whole sweep of the war this account is about to tell you, because dates and treaties can make 80 years feel abstract in a way no single human lifespan ever is. Consider a child born in the city of Haarlem in the very year Alba first arrived in the Low Countries, 1567, a child who would have been 5 years old when the Sea Beggars took Brielle, 6 when her own city endured the 7-month siege and the mass execution this account is going to describe, a young woman by the time Antwerp burned in the Spanish fury, a mother, very possibly, by the time William of the Orange was shot in Delft, a grandmother by the time the 12 years' truce finally brought the first uninterrupted peace her own family had ever known, and, if she lived to the genuinely old age of 81, a woman who would have been alive to hear the church bells ring across Holland in 1548, when word finally arrived from the German city of Münster that the king in Madrid had, at last, formally given up. No single such person's own life survives in any record this account can name for you, but her own shape, dimly, stands in for the many thousands like her, an entire population that was born, grew old, and died without ever, at any point in an ordinary human life, having lived under a settled peace. It is worth naming plainly the specific policies through which Philip's own government began, almost immediately after Charles's abdication, to alarm and alienate the very nobility whose cooperation any Habsburg ruler of these provinces had always depended on to actually govern. Philip left behind, when he departed for Spain in 1559, a regent, his own half-sister Margaret, Duchess of Parma, an intelligent and generally capable woman who nonetheless found herself, from the very start of her own regency, hemmed in by instructions from Madrid that left her remarkably little, genuine room to manoeuvre, and at her side wielding an influence that the great noble families of the Low Countries came to resent with a bitterness that would matter enormously to everything that followed, sat Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle, a cardinal and skilled administrator whom Philip trusted completely, and whom the local nobility despised as a foreign upstart, a low-born cleric elevated above men whose own families had governed these provinces for centuries. Philip's government pursued, across the early 1560s, a programme of religious and administrative centralisation that struck at the region's own traditional privileges from several directions simultaneously. Most consequentially, a sweeping reorganisation of the Low Countries' own ecclesiastical map in 1559, replacing an old and haphazard arrangement of a handful of bishoprics, several of which technically answered to foreign archbishops outside Philip's own control, with 14 new, tightly organised dioceses answering directly to an archbishop in Mechelen, a reform genuinely sensible on strictly administrative and religious grounds, intended to give the Church a real fighting chance of combating the spread of Protestant heresy district by district, but one the local nobility and the traditional clergy alike experienced as a direct assault on their own established rights, a fear that the new, more numerous bishops would serve chiefly as an expanded arm of royal and inquisitorial authority, reaching further into local affairs than any bishop had reached before. It is worth naming too the specific religious currents already moving through these provinces well before Philip's own reforms arrived, because the Low Countries had, for decades, proven unusually fertile ground for reform-minded Christianity, even under Charles's own rule. The printing presses of Antwerp, one of the most productive publishing centres in the whole of Europe, had spread the works of Martin Luther throughout the region within years of his own first defiance of Rome, and by the time Philip inherited these provinces, Lutheranism had already been substantially overtaken, in the towns and countryside of Flanders and Holland alike, by the considerably more organised and considerably more radical Calvinism, a faith that had taken particularly deep root among the artisans and merchants of the southern textile towns, a movement whose own underground network of travelling preachers, secret nighttime sermons held in fields and forests just beyond a town's own jurisdiction, called, in the language of the day, hedge preaching, and smuggled devotional literature had, by the middle 1560s, built a genuinely substantial Calvinist community that Philip's inherited machinery of religious persecution, the same placards and inquisitorial courts that had executed heretics under Charles's own rule for decades already, proved entirely unable to stamp out, a persecution that had already claimed, by most careful modern estimates, several thousand lives across the middle decades of the century, a toll that made the Low Countries one of the bloodiest theatres of the whole European Reformation, even before the war this story describes tonight had properly begun. It is worth naming, too, the specific and remarkably durable organisational structure that allowed this underground Calvinist movement to survive decades of persecution when a less disciplined faith might simply have been stamped out, because the reformed congregations spreading through the Low Countries organised themselves from their earliest years into a network of consistories, local governing councils of elected elders and deacons who managed each individual congregation's own discipline and charity, linked upward through regional classes and eventually broader synods, a Presbyterian structure that gave this persecuted, officially illegal faith a genuine and resilient institutional backbone even while its own individual members worshipped in secret, meeting in private homes, in rented barns just outside a town's own legal jurisdiction, and, when circumstances allowed, in the open fields where the hedge preaching this story is already named could draw crowds numbering, on occasion and by contemporary report, in the thousands, congregations that armed themselves increasingly as the 1560s wore on, not merely with scripture but with actual weapons, aware that a gathering of this size and this illegality might be broken up by force at any moment, and it is worth naming plainly that this same consistory structure, forged underground under decades of persecution, would go on, once the northern provinces had won their own independence, to become the actual governing skeleton of the Dutch Reformed Church that dominated the religious life of the new republic for centuries afterward, an institution built, quite literally, in hiding. It is worth naming, too, the specific communities of exiled Low Countries Protestants that had already been gathering for the better part of a decade before Alba ever set foot in Brussels, in a handful of foreign cities willing to shelter them, because Antwerp merchants and Flemish weavers, fleeing the earlier waves of persecution under Charles V and the opening years of Philip's own reign, had, by the early 1560s, established genuine and organised exile congregations in London, in the German towns of Emden and Wesel, and in the free imperial city of Cologne, communities that maintained their own printing presses, their own consistories, and their own steady correspondence with the underground churches still operating inside the Low Countries. And it is worth naming plainly that these same exiled communities, considerably more than any single dramatic event inside the provinces themselves, functioned across the 1560s as the movement's own quiet organisational backbone, printing and smuggling home the pamphlets and translated scripture that fed the underground consistories, sheltering and rearming the noblemen and privateers who would eventually become the Sea Beggars, and giving William of Orange, once his own exile in Germany began in earnest in 1567, a network of sympathetic merchants and financiers scattered across half a dozen foreign cities, from which he could, however precariously, continue to raise the money his own repeated invasions required. A petition of nobles, and the insult that became a badge of honour. It is worth naming plainly the specific moment at which the lesser nobility of the Low Countries, men who held real local standing and real grievances, but who had, until this point, generally worked within the existing system rather than against it, first organised themselves into open, collective resistance, because in April of 1566, a delegation of several hundred lesser noblemen, organised loosely around a league that called itself the Compromise of Nobles, rode to the Regent Margaret's own palace in Brussels to present a formal petition, requesting in carefully moderate and carefully loyal language that the harshest edicts against religious dissent be suspended, and that the whole matter be referred to a meeting of the States General, the traditional representative body of the provinces, rather than being decided by inquisitorial decree from Madrid. A petition that was, by any reasonable reading, an act of loyal remonstrance rather than rebellion, the ordinary language of subjects appealing to their own sovereign's better judgment through entirely established channels. It is worth naming, too, the single unguarded remark made by one of Margaret's own councillors, a nobleman named Belemont, that would go on to matter more to the movement's own later identity than almost anything actually written in the petition itself, because as the delegation withdrew from the regent's presence, Berlaymont is reported to have leaned toward Margaret and dismissed the assembled noblemen, in French, as nothing more than gueux, beggars, a contemptuous aside clearly not meant for the ears of the men it described, and the delegation, hearing of the remark within days, did something that would become, in retrospect, one of the single cleverest pieces of political branding in the whole of this long war, adopting the insult deliberately and publicly as their own name, wearing grey beggars' cloaks and wooden begging bowls to their own subsequent banquets, striking medals stamped with a beggar satchel and the motto "Faithful to the King even unto beggary," and turning a single dismissive sneer from a royal counsellor into the rallying identity that would carry within 6 years all the way to that unguarded harbour at Brielle. It is worth naming, too, exactly how Margaret's own regency actually responded to the nobles' petition in the weeks that followed, because Margaret, genuinely alarmed by the size and the standing of the delegation that had ridden to Brussels and considerably more inclined toward pragmatic compromise than her own brother back in Madrid, agreed, in what came to be called the Accord of 1566, to suspend the harshest inquisitorial persecution, while the whole religious question was referred upward for a fuller settlement, a genuine if temporary concession that gave the Low Country's own underground reformed congregations, for the first time in living memory, several months of open or nearly open worship, the hedge preaching this story has already described moving, in a number of towns, from remote fields into the open air just outside the town walls, with a boldness that would have been unthinkable only months earlier. It is worth naming plainly exactly how briefly that opening actually lasted, because the sudden visibility of Calvinist worship that Margaret's own concession permitted fed directly into the very same religious confidence and the very same social unrest that would explode only weeks later into the Beldenstorm this account is about to describe, and Philip, learning of both the accord and the destruction that followed it, within the same dispatches from Brussels, drew from the whole sequence exactly the opposite lesson his own regent had hoped he would draw, concluding not that toleration had needed more time to work, but that toleration itself was precisely what had produced the iconoclasm, a conclusion that doomed any further experiment in Habsburg conciliation in the Low Countries for a full generation to come. It is worth naming plainly exactly what happened in the months immediately after the nobles' petition, because the summer of 1566 produced one of the single most dramatic and most consequential episodes of the entire pre-war period, a wave of iconoclastic violence that contemporaries and later historians alike came to call the Beelden Storm, the Image Storm. Beginning in August in the region of West Flanders and spreading with astonishing speed across the southern and then the northern provinces alike, bands of Calvinist zealots, often numbering only a few dozen men in any single town, moved through Catholic churches, cathedrals and monasteries, smashing statues of saints, shattering stained glass, burning altarpieces and vestments, and destroying in a matter of weeks religious art and architecture that had taken generations of craftsmen to build, a wave of destruction that swept through several hundred churches before it finally exhausted itself by early autumn. And it is worth naming honestly that this violence, whatever genuine theological conviction lay behind the specific Calvinist doctrine that regarded religious imagery as idolatrous, functioned also, and perhaps primarily as raw social and economic protest, carried out disproportionately by poorer artisans and weavers whose own livelihoods had been battered by a severe economic downturn and a bad harvest in the same year, a fact several careful modern historians have used to argue that the Beelden Storm was, at bottom, considerably more a riot of the desperate and the dispossessed than a purely doctrinal crusade, even as it was received in Madrid, and by Philip personally, as unambiguous and unforgivable proof that heresy and rebellion in the Low Countries had, at last, fully merged into a single existential threat to both his own crown and his own soul's salvation. The Duke of Alba and a council the people renamed themselves. It is worth naming plainly exactly how Philip chose to respond to the shock of the Beelden Storm, because his response would set the whole tone, and very nearly the whole course, of the war that followed. In the summer of 1567, Philip dispatched to the Low Countries an army of some 10,000 veteran Spanish and Italian soldiers under the command of Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, a general in his own 60s by this point, a hardened and genuinely gifted soldier whose own decades of service to the Habsburg crown had earned him Philip's complete trust, and whose own instructions upon arrival left little room for the kind of conciliatory compromise Margaret's own regency had, however imperfectly, still attempted, because Alba came not merely to restore order, but to punish, comprehensively and without leniency, every person of any rank who could be shown to have had any hand whatsoever in the disturbances of the preceding year. Alba established, within months of his own arrival, a special tribunal formally titled the Council of Troubles, a body that bypassed the existing local courts and their own traditional legal protections entirely, and that the population of the Low Countries, with the same instinct for grim, defiant naming that had already turned an insult into the beggar's own proud identity, began calling instead the Council of Blood, a body that would go on, across its own several years of operation, to try more than 12,000 people, executing, by the most careful modern counts, historians have been able to reconstruct from the surviving trial records, somewhere in the range of 1,000 people outright, and confiscating the property of many thousands more who fled into exile rather than face the tribunal at all, a campaign of judicial terror carried out, worth naming plainly, against a population that had, for the most part, committed no crime beyond attending a forbidden sermon, or failing to actively denounce a neighbour who had. It is worth pausing briefly on the man history remembers almost entirely through the Council of Blood and the two executions this story is about to describe, because Fernando Alvarez de Toledo had spent, by the time he arrived in the Low Countries in 1567, more than 4 decades in the service of the Habsburg crown, a soldier who had fought his own first campaign as a teenager, who had commanded Charles V's own armies with real distinction across Italy and Germany, and who understood himself, by every surviving account of his own private correspondence, not as a monster, but as an old and exhaustively loyal servant of the crown carrying out, with the same disciplined thoroughness he had always brought to every task Charles and then Philip had given him, an assignment he had been explicitly instructed to treat as a matter of both political necessity and religious duty, a man who wrote to Philip in his own hand of his own genuine conviction that severity now would spare considerably more bloodshed later, a calculation history has not been kind to, and one Alba himself, by most accounts, never once seriously doubted even in his own old age. It is worth naming too that William's own resistance movement, from its very earliest and most desperate years, drew real if inconsistent support from Protestant sympathisers scattered across the rest of Europe, because Louis of Nassau's own failed 1568 invasion had been funded and manned in substantial part by German Lutheran and Calvinist princes, and by French Huguenot volunteers crossing the border to fight alongside a cause they understood correctly as part of the same wider continental struggle their own countries were fighting at home, a pattern of foreign Protestant solidarity, German money, French volunteers, and, later, formal English intervention, that would recur unevenly across the whole of this war, never quite enough in any single decade to guarantee the rebellion's own victory outright, but consistently enough to keep William's own cause alive through years when the rebel province's own resources alone would very likely not have sufficed. It is worth naming honestly that Alba's own 6 years in the Low Countries were not spent purely on the Council of Blood and its own executions, because Alba also built, funded and administered a genuinely significant expansion of the region's own road and canal infrastructure, reformed its own currency, and left behind, in the considerable body of his own surviving administrative correspondence, the record of a man who plainly believed he was governing well, a self-perception so thoroughly at odds with the 6,000 or more Low Countries subjects, his own tribunal condemned that it stands, in this account's own judgment, as one of the more genuinely unsettling reminders this whole story has to offer, that cruelty carried out with a full and untroubled conscience is not any less cruel for the sincerity behind it. It is worth naming too the sheer logistical achievement and the sheer logistical burden that keeping a Spanish army in the field in the Low Countries actually represented, because the force Alba brought north in 1567 and the larger army of Flanders that Spain would go on to maintain there for decades afterward was recruited overwhelmingly not from Spain itself, but from Spanish Italy, Naples, Sicily, and Milan chief among them, alongside German and Walloon mercenary regiments, and a smaller corps of ethnically Spanish veteran infantry, the famous tercios, and moving this army, along with the money to pay it, from Habsburg territory in Italy to the Low Countries required, since the most direct sea route around the coasts of France and England had become dangerously exposed to English and French privateers, and eventually to the Dutch rebels' own navy. An alternative overland route that Spanish logisticians perfected across the 1570s and after, a corridor of friendly or neutral territory running north from Spanish Milan through Savoy, Franche-Comté and Lorraine into Luxembourg, a route contemporaries and modern historians alike came to call the Spanish Road, a genuinely remarkable feat of early modern military logistics that allowed Spain to reinforce and resupply its own war in the Low Countries for decades without ever needing to risk the sea route at all, though it is worth naming honestly that maintaining this army, however cleverly supplied, remained ruinously expensive throughout the whole of the war, a single year's campaign in the Low Countries costing Philip's own treasury sums that dwarf the ordinary annual revenue of most European kingdoms combined, and it was this same crushing, compounding cost, considerably more than any single Dutch victory in the field, that would eventually grind Spain's own capacity to continue the war down to nothing. It is worth naming too the single execution, among the 1,000 the Council of Blood ordered, that shocked the wider nobility of Europe more deeply than any other, because on the 5th of June 1568, in the Great Market Square of Brussels, before a crowd Alba had specifically ordered assembled to witness the spectacle, two of the most senior and most respected noblemen in the entire Low Countries, the Count of Egmont and the Count of Horn, both of them men who had served the Habsburg crown loyally for decades, both of them devout Catholics who had never joined the Protestant cause, and who had, if anything, urged moderation rather than defiance in the years leading up to Alba's arrival, were beheaded on Alba's own direct order on charges of treason that rested on little more than their own failure to actively suppress the unrest of the preceding years with sufficient zeal, a killing that sent an unmistakable message across the whole of the Low Countries and across the courts of Europe that watched it. Because if two such loyal, such Catholic, such thoroughly established noblemen could be executed on Alba's own word, then no one, however carefully they had tried to walk the narrow line between loyalty and conscience, could consider themselves safe any longer. And it is worth naming honestly that this single execution did more to convince the wavering nobility of the Low Countries that armed resistance had become their own only remaining option than any single sermon, any single tax, or any single act of religious persecution that had come before it. It is worth naming too the specific fiscal policy through which Alba, having already alienated the nobility with the Council of Blood's own executions, went on to alienate the whole of the merchant and artisan population of the Low Countries as well, a proposed tax known as the 10th penny. A 10% levy Alba attempted to impose in 1571 on every single commercial sale conducted anywhere in the 17 provinces, a tax structured in a way that revealed, more clearly than almost anything else Alba did during his own 6 years governing the Low Countries, just how poorly a general accustomed to garrison towns and campaign requisitions actually understood the commercial economy he had been sent to administer. because a 10% tax applied at every single stage of a chain of sale, from raw wool to finished cloth to the merchant who exported it, compounded with every single transaction in a way that threatened to make ordinary trade in the Low Country's own wealthier cities effectively unprofitable, and the outcry from Antwerp's own merchant community, joined by tradesmen and shopkeepers across dozens of towns who staged something close to a coordinated commercial strike rather than submit to the new levy, closing their own shops and warehouses rather than pay it, proved severe enough that Alba was eventually forced to scale the tax back considerably, though not before the mere threat of it had done lasting damage to the loyalty of a merchant class that had, until this point, remained considerably more cautious about open rebellion than the nobility and the clergy, already alienated by the Council of Blood. It is worth naming plainly the man who had already fled rather than wait to discover whether he too would be summoned before the Council of Blood, William, Prince of Orange, a nobleman of considerable wealth and considerable standing who had, until this point in his own life, served the Habsburg crown with genuine loyalty, raised at the imperial court under Charles V himself, entrusted with senior military and administrative commands, a man whose own religious convictions across these years remain, to modern historians who have studied his own surviving correspondence closely, genuinely difficult to pin down with any confidence, since William had been raised Lutheran, converted to Catholicism as a young man to secure his own standing at court, and would eventually, decades later, embrace Calvinism, a fluid and pragmatic relationship with confessional identity that his own enemies would later use against him, but that his own defenders would come to see as evidence of a man for whom religious toleration was never merely convenient rhetoric, but a genuinely held political principle, forged in no small part from his own personal experience of how readily a single faith enforced by the sword could turn neighbour against neighbour. William, warned that his own name appeared on lists the Council of Troubles was compiling, withdrew across the border into Germany in the spring of 1567, and it was from this German exile, without an army, without a treasury, and without any secure territory of his own to operate from, that William began the long, patient, and for many years, genuinely unsuccessful work of organising armed resistance against the government Alba had built. It is worth naming too William's own first attempt at open military resistance, because it ended, like nearly every one of William's own personally commanded campaigns across the following decade would end in defeat, though not without one small and symbolically important exception. In the spring of 1568, William's own younger brother, Louis of Nassau, leading a small mercenary force raised with borrowed money and desperate hope, won a genuine if modest victory over Alba's own local garrison forces at the Battle of Heilige Lee in the northern province of Groningen in May of that year. A battle later generations of Dutch historians would come to mark, somewhat arbitrarily but not unreasonably, as the formal opening engagement of the entire 80 Years' War, though Louis's own subsequent campaign collapsed within weeks, when Alba personally marched north with the main Spanish army and crushed the rebel force decisively at the Battle of Jemmingen in July, and William's own separate invasion later that same year, a considerably larger effort funded substantially by his own personal fortune and by loans he would spend the rest of his own life struggling to repay, dissolved without ever forcing Alba into a decisive engagement at all, Alba's own veteran Spanish infantry simply refusing battle and waiting William's mercenary army out until its own unpaid soldiers began deserting in large numbers. A pattern of costly, unglamorous failure that would define William's own military leadership for years to come, and that makes his own eventual status as father of his country considerably more a testament to sheer, grinding persistence than to any particular genius on the battlefield. It is worth naming too a private and genuinely painful cost William's own family bore before this war had even properly begun in earnest, because in 1568, in the same season as William's own first failed invasions, Spanish authorities seized William's own eldest son, Philip William, then a 13-year-old boy studying at the university in Leuven, and transported him to Spain, where Philip II, in a calculated act of both punishment and leverage, had the boy raised at the Spanish court itself, converted to Catholicism, and educated as a loyal Spanish nobleman with no meaningful contact with his own father across the whole of the following war. And it is worth naming plainly that Philip William did not return to the Low Countries at all until 1596, more than a decade after his own father's assassination, arriving as a grown man who spoke Dutch imperfectly, practised a faith his own countrymen had fought a war to reject, and felt, by every surviving account of his own uneasy homecoming, considerably more Spanish than Dutch, a genuinely strange and rarely told coda to the story of the war's own founding family, one further reminder alongside the deaths of Louis and Henry of Nassau. This account has already named that this revolution's own cost was never paid only on distant battlefields, but inside the households of the very men who led it. The town that fell without a fight, and the flood of rebellion it set loose. It is worth returning now to the harbour at Brielle where this story began tonight, because the capture of that town by the exiled Sea Beggars on the 1st of April 1572 was not, in the moment it happened, understood by anyone involved as the opening of a lasting national uprising, but rather as a stroke of pure, undeserved good fortune for a fleet that had, until days earlier, been sailing without any clear destination at all. It is worth naming plainly exactly how these particular beggars had come to be at sea, homeless in the first place, because for several years after fleeing the Low Countries, a substantial number of exiled noblemen, disaffected sailors, and outright privateers operating loosely under letters of authorization from William of Orange himself had found safe harbour in the ports of England, using them as a base from which to raid Spanish and Catholic shipping in the Channel, an arrangement Elizabeth I of England had tolerated for years as a useful way of harassing Spain without formally declaring war on her, until, in March of 1572, for reasons rooted in the delicate diplomacy Elizabeth was at that moment attempting with Spain, she abruptly expelled the entire Sea Beggar fleet from English waters, leaving several dozen ships and several hundred men with nowhere at all to go, forced, in genuine desperation rather than grand strategy, to sail back toward the coast they had fled years earlier and see what, if anything, they might find there. It is worth naming, too, exactly why Brielle, of all the ports along that coast, proved so catastrophically undefended, because its own Spanish-appointed garrison commander had, in the days immediately before the Beggars' arrival, marched the bulk of his own available troops toward the nearby city of Utrecht to help suppress unrelated unrest there, leaving behind a token force wholly inadequate to defend the town's own walls against even a modest and thoroughly unplanned assault, and the Beggars' own leader on that particular morning, a nobleman named Willem van der Mark, Lord of Lumey, a man whose own subsequent conduct across the following months would prove considerably less admirable than the moment of the capture itself, seized the town, tore down the Spanish coat of arms from the town gate, and raised in its place an improvised flag, an act that, once news of it spread along the coast in the days that followed, produced a genuinely remarkable and genuinely unplanned chain reaction, because town after town across the province of Holland, emboldened by the sudden proof that Alba's own forces were neither omnipresent nor invincible, began expelling their own small Spanish garrisons and declaring for the Prince of Orange in turn, flushing within days, Enkhuizen soon after, until, within a matter of weeks, the greater part of the province of Holland, along with substantial portions of Zeeland, had thrown off royal authority entirely, a spread of revolt so rapid and so largely spontaneous that William of Orange himself, still in exile in Germany at the moment Brielle actually fell, learned of the town's capture only after the fact, and moved with real haste to formally claim leadership of an uprising that had, in its own opening days, begun considerably without him. It is worth naming too the single largest naval engagement of this opening phase of the war, because the newly liberated Holland towns could not hope to hold what they had won without also contesting Spain's own access to the Zuider Zee, the great shallow inland sea that gave the province its own economic and military lifeline. And in October of 1573 a fleet of Sea Beggar ships met a Spanish fleet under the command of the Count of Bossu, the Crown's own appointed admiral for the region, in open battle on those same waters, a fight the rebel fleet, considerably more familiar with the Zuider Zee's own shallow and treacherous shoals than any Spanish captain could hope to be, won decisively, capturing Bossu himself along with his own flagship, a victory that secured Holland's own inland waterways for the rebellion for years to come, and that demonstrated, this early in the war, a pattern that would hold true again and again across the following decades, that the geography of the Low Countries, water where an enemy expected land and land where an enemy expected open sea, rewarded the side that had spent generations actually living on it far more reliably than it rewarded the side with the larger army. It is worth naming plainly one genuinely surprising exception to the general pattern of Holland towns rushing to join the uprising in 1572, because the city that would eventually become the rebellion's own single greatest beneficiary, Amsterdam, did not join the revolt at all in that first spring, remaining instead a loyal, Catholic-majority Spanish garrisoned town for a further 6 years, while nearly every other city in the province around it declared for William of Orange, its own conservative and heavily Catholic merchant elite judging continued loyalty to Philip's own crown, whatever the religious cost, considerably safer for their own trade than joining an uprising that still looked, in these opening years, entirely capable of losing. Amsterdam finally changed sides only in May of 1578, in a swift, largely bloodless internal coup, remembered ever after as the Alterati, the Alteration, in which the city's own Calvinist and pro-Orange faction, backed by a rebel military force gathered outside the city walls, peacefully expelled the sitting Catholic town government and the Spanish garrison alike, and replaced them overnight with a new Protestant, pro-rebel administration, a bloodless changeover so different from the sieges and massacres this whole story has otherwise described that it is easy to overlook entirely. And it is worth naming, honestly, that the city later generations would remember as the natural and inevitable capital of the Dutch Golden Age, spent the first 6 years of this war as one of the rebellion's own most stubborn holdouts, a detail the city's own later, spectacular success has done a great deal to quietly erase from popular memory. It is worth naming plainly the specific and genuinely important constitutional moment at which this scattered, town-by-town uprising acquired something resembling a formal government. Because in July of 1572, representatives of the rebel towns of Holland gathered at Dordrecht, the province's own oldest and most senior city, in an assembly of the states of Holland that formally recognised William of Orange, still in exile in Germany at the time, as the province's own rightful stadtholder, the traditional Habsburg title for a provincial governor, an act of considerable legal cleverness because it allowed the assembled rebel towns to claim they were not rebelling against the sultan's, rather the king's, own legitimate authority at all, but simply restoring William to an office Philip himself had once appointed him to, and had, in the rebels' own careful legal argument, unlawfully stripped from him, a fiction of continued loyalty to the crown that the rebel provinces would maintain, at least in their own official language, for nearly another decade, right up until the act of abjuration this story will describe later tonight finally discarded it. The Dordrecht Assembly's own delegates, meeting under William's own distant authority, additionally proclaim freedom of worship for Protestants across the rebel towns while, notably stopping well short of banning Catholic practice outright, a genuinely careful early attempt at exactly the kind of pragmatic religious balancing act the fuller Union of Utrecht would later try to codify, and it is worth naming plainly that this same assembly voted the funds drawn from the province's own merchants and towns that allowed William to finally return from exile and take up, in person, the leadership a homeless fleet of beggars had already thrust upon him from a harbour he had not been present for. It is worth naming, honestly, that this same wave of liberation carried with it, from its very first weeks, a considerably darker undercurrent that Dutch national memory has not always been eager to dwell on, because the Sea Beggars who spread this revolt along the Holland coast were not for the most part disciplined soldiers acting under any centralised command, but a genuinely rough and often uncontrollable mixture of exiled noblemen, hardened privateers and outright opportunists, and in town after captured town, Catholic clergy, monks and religious property became the specific target of exactly the kind of mob violence and outright murder that the earlier Beeldenstorm had only foreshadowed. It is worth naming plainly the single most notorious of these episodes, the martyrdom of a group of Catholic clergymen, priests and Franciscan friars who had been taken captive when the town of Gorinchem fell to beggar forces, and who were transported to Brielle itself, and on the 9th of July 1572, hanged in a peat shed on Lumet's own direct order, despite William of Orange's explicit written instructions, sent too late to prevent the killing, that the prisoners be spared, a massacre the Catholic Church would go on to formally canonise its own victims for, the martyrs of Gorkum, centuries later, and a killing that this account owes the same honest attention it is going to give, later tonight, to the massacres Spanish forces would themselves commit against captured rebel towns, because a war remembered honestly cannot afford to keep the ledger of atrocity on only one side of the fighting. It is worth naming honestly that Alba's own response to the sudden loss of so much of Holland was not limited to the sieges this story is about to describe, because in the autumn and winter of 1572, as his own army began the slow work of reconquest, Alba's forces carried out a deliberate campaign of exemplary terror against towns that had joined the revolt, a campaign this account owes the same honest attention it has already given to the killings committed by the rebel beggars at Gorkum. At the town of Zutphen, captured in November of 1572, Alba's own son, Fadrique, commanding the army in his father's name, ordered the garrison and a substantial portion of the civilian population put to the sword. Contemporary accounts describing bodies left hanging from trees along the road out of the town, specifically so that travellers passing by would carry word of the punishment to every other town still weighing whether to join the rebellion, and at Naarden, a small and largely undefended town on the Zuiderzee captured only weeks later in December, Spanish troops, after accepting the town's own formal surrender and being welcomed inside its walls, turned on the population anyway, herding much of the town into its own church and setting it alight, killing, by most careful modern estimates, several hundred people in a town whose own total population had never numbered more than a few thousand to begin with, a massacre carried out, this account has to say plainly, against a town that had already surrendered and posed no further resistance at all, precisely the kind of calculated terror Alba had hoped would break the rebellion's own morale, and that instead, exactly as it would with Haarlem's own executed garrison the following summer, hardened Holland's own resolve to resist rather than trust in the mercy of a surrender. It is worth naming too that this same autumn campaign produced a third such massacre at Mechelen, a wealthy city in Brabant that had briefly declared for the rebel cause before Alba's own forces retook it in October of 1572, subjecting the city to 3 days of looting and killing that contemporary accounts describe in terms nearly as harsh as those later applied to Antwerp's own Spanish fury 4 years afterward, a massacre considerably less remembered today than Antwerp's own only, because Mechelen's own population was smaller and its own commercial importance to the wider European economy considerably less. A genuinely important reminder that the scale of a massacre's own later fame does not always track the scale of its own actual cruelty. Two sieges that taught the empire it could still lose. It is worth naming plainly the specific and genuinely brutal test of wills that the newly liberated province of Holland faced almost immediately. Because Alba, whatever the shock of losing so much territory so quickly, still commanded in the autumn and winter of 1572 the finest professional army in Europe, and he turned that army, methodically and mercilessly, toward reconquering the province town by town. The city of Haarlem, besieged from December of 1572 through the following July, endured 7 months of bombardment, starvation, and increasingly desperate sortie fighting before its own exhausted defenders, having eaten the last of the town's own horses, dogs, and eventually the leather of their own shoes and harnesses, finally surrendered on terms Alba's own commanders promptly and brutally violated, executing, by most contemporary accounts, some 1,700 of the town's own soldiers and civilian leaders in the days immediately following the surrender, a massacre carried out specifically, in the words of Alba's own son who commanded the besieging force, to make an example severe enough that no other Holland town would dare to resist as long or as stubbornly again. It is worth pausing here on one particular and genuinely beloved piece of later Dutch memory attached to this same siege that deserves the same careful scrutiny this story is going to apply, later tonight, to the legend of Peter van der Werf's own offered body at Leiden, the story of Kanaal Simonsdochter Hasselaar, a real and prosperous Haarlem widow who ran her own timber and shipping business, remembered in popular legend as having personally led a company of some 300 armed women onto the town's own walls to fight alongside the male garrison across the siege's own 7 brutal months, a story that spread rapidly across Protestant Europe within the war's own lifetime, and that turned Kanaal into a folk heroine so enduring that her own name eventually entered the Dutch language itself as a common noun for a formidable, sharp-tongued woman. Modern historians, working back through the actual surviving Haarlem town records and siege accounts, have found solid evidence that Kanaal Hasselaar was a real person of real local standing, who very likely did contribute materially to the town's own defence, supplying labour and resources from her own shipping business, but have found considerably less solid evidence for the specific company of 300 armed women fighting on the walls, a detail that appears to have been embellished and enlarged, with each retelling across the following decades until the historical Kanaal and the legendary one became almost impossible to fully separate, and it is worth naming honestly that this same pattern, a genuine and admirable contribution dressed in the retelling, in a considerably more dramatic and more simplified garment than the record can fully support, is a pattern this account has already shown you once tonight already, and will show you again before this story ends. It is worth naming plainly how badly that specific calculation misfired, because the town of Alkmaar, besieged only weeks after Haarlem's own fall, chose, rather than the surrender Alba had hoped his example would encourage, an altogether more desperate and more distinctly Dutch form of resistance. Because in October of 1573, with Spanish forces tightening around the town's own walls and the garrison's own supplies running dangerously low, Alkmaar's defenders made the deliberate decision to open the very dikes and sluices that protected the surrounding countryside from the sea, flooding the low-lying farmland around the town and turning the ground the besieging Spanish army needed to camp, manoeuvre and supply itself across into an impassable, waterlogged marsh, a tactic that forced Alba's own commanders to abandon the siege entirely within weeks, the first clear, unambiguous defeat the Duke of Alba's own forces had suffered anywhere in the Low Countries since his arrival, and a victory that gave rise, almost immediately, to a proud local saying that would echo through Dutch memory for centuries afterward, that at Alkmaar victory began. It is worth naming too the siege that would come to matter more than almost any other single episode of the war's opening years to the way the Dutch Republic would eventually understand its own origins. The Siege of Leiden, which began in the spring of 1574, and, after a brief interruption, when the besieging Spanish force withdrew to meet a separate rebel army in the field, resumed in earnest that summer and dragged the city's own population toward a genuinely desperate starvation across the following months, its own citizens reduced, by the autumn, to eating dogs, cats, and eventually a thin, disease-ridden gruel of tree bark and boiled leather, a suffering the town's own burgomaster, Peter van der Werf, is remembered, in an account later generations would treat with the same careful, honest skepticism this channel applies to every such legend, as having offered his own body to the starving population to eat rather than surrender the town, a story almost certainly more legend than fact, but one that captures, however embellished, the genuine desperation of those final weeks. William of Orange, unable to relieve the city by any conventional military means, made the extraordinary decision in September of 1574 to breach the dikes protecting the surrounding polders on purpose, deliberately drowning farmland his own struggling war effort could ill afford to sacrifice in order to float a fleet of shallow-bottom relief vessels, crewed once again by Sea Beggars, directly across the newly created inland sea toward the city's own walls, an operation delayed for agonizing weeks by contrary winds and by water that at first proved stubbornly too shallow for the relief fleet to cross, until, in the first days of October, the wind finally shifted, the water rose high enough, and the fleet sailed in over what had been productive grain fields only weeks before, breaking the siege in the very last days before the city's own surrender would otherwise have become unavoidable, and Leiden's own grateful leadership, once the crisis had passed, chose, when William offered the town its choice of reward, a permanent exemption from taxation or the founding of a university, to take the university instead, a decision that would make Leiden, within a single generation, one of the most respected centres of Protestant learning anywhere in Europe. It's worth naming too a second and considerably more sorrowful cost, this same year, exacted on William of Orange's own family, because in April of 1574, only months before the relief fleet finally reached Leiden, two of William's own brothers, Louis of Nassau, whose own earlier victory at Heiligerlee this story has already named, and their younger brother Henry were both killed on the same afternoon at the Battle of Mookerheide near the German border, leading a mercenary army whose own unpaid and mutinous soldiers had refused to advance until back wages were settled, a delay that let a Spanish force catch and annihilate them before the campaign had properly begun, and neither brother's own body was ever recovered from the field, a private grief William carried, by every surviving account of his own correspondence from these months, alongside the public burden of the siege at Leiden, a reminder, worth naming plainly, that the cost of this war fell on the Nassau family's own household as heavily in these particular months as it fell on any single ordinary town. It is worth pausing, before this story moves on from these opening sieges, on what the actual daily texture of a town like Haarlem or Leiden under siege would have felt like from the inside, because it is easy, reciting dates and casualty figures, to lose the plain physical reality underneath them. It would have meant weeks and eventually months of a low, constant, irregular thunder of cannon fire against the town's own walls, a sound residents learn to sleep through the way people anywhere eventually learn to sleep through anything that never stops, punctuated by the considerably more alarming and more specific crash of a single shot finding a house rather than the wall it was aimed at. It would have meant the slow, creeping arithmetic of rationing, bread cut smaller each week, then replaced with coarser grain, then with the flour ground from whatever remained, horse and dog and eventually leather boiled for whatever thin nutrition the boiling could coax out of it, a hunger that fell hardest, as hunger under siege always does, on the very old, the very young, and the very poor, who had the least stored reserve of their own body's own fat to draw on when the official rations ran short. It would have meant the particular fear that came with knowing precisely what happened to towns that resisted too long and lost anyway. A fear Haarlem's own defenders carried with real and specific weight. Once word of a captured town's fate had travelled ahead of any siege, and it would have meant too the strange and genuinely human persistence of ordinary life continuing underneath all of it. Marriages still performed, children still born, sermons still preached, market days still nominally observed even when there was next to nothing left to sell. Because a population under siege does not stop living in the gaps between bombardments. It simply learns, out of necessity, to live smaller and more carefully within them. It is worth naming too that the burden of this long war never fell evenly across the population of the 17 provinces, because the merchants and regents who eventually governed the independent republic, and the noble families on both sides of the front line who negotiated truces and treaties from positions of real comfort, bore only a fraction of what the war actually cost the ordinary farmers, weavers, and fishermen whose own fields were the ones flooded on purpose, whose own towns were the ones starved into surrender, and whose own sons filled the ranks of armies on both sides for wages that, when they arrived at all, arrived late and diminished by the same chronic treasury failures this story has already described. A prosperous Holland regent, sitting on the province's own governing council, could weather even the war's worst years behind city walls that mostly held, his own capital diversified enough to absorb the interruption of any single trade route, while a tenant farmer on the flooded polders around Leiden lost, in a single season, land his own family had worked for generations, land that would take years to drain and reclaim, even after the water that had saved the city receded, a debt of ordinary, unglamorous loss. This account owes the same honest naming it has already given to the massacres, because a war remembered only in the language of sieges and treaties leaves out almost everyone who actually lived through it. It is worth naming too the composite ordinary shape of a life this war actually touched, because no single grand narrative of sieges and treaties can quite capture what it meant for the thousands of individual households scattered across the 17 provinces who left behind no letters any archive thought worth preserving. It meant a weaver's widow in a captured Flemish town taking over her own late husband's loom and his own place in the local guild, a position widow after widow across this war's own long decades found herself thrust into by simple demographic necessity rather than by any deliberate expansion of women's own legal standing, since Low Countries law in this period generally permitted a widow to continue running her own late husband's business, specifically because a business idle was a business that stopped paying its own share of the town's own war taxes. It meant a farmer's son conscripted willingly or otherwise into one army or another, sending home when the army's own pay actually arrived, whatever small sum he could spare. And it meant for the families who never received any such letter at all, this slow and uncertain grief of simply not knowing, for months or years, whether a son lost somewhere on campaign was dead, captured, or merely delayed. An uncertainty this account has no single dramatic anecdote to offer, because it was, by its own very nature, the quietest and least documented form the war's own suffering ever took. It is worth naming too the man whose own comparatively weak and comparatively short governorship set the stage for the catastrophe at Antwerp this story is about to describe, because Alba himself, worn down by 6 years of a war he'd been sent to win quickly and had instead dragged into open-ended stalemate, was recalled to Spain in disgrace in late 1573, replaced by Don Luis de Requesens, a considerably more moderate and considerably less feared governor who attempted, across his own 3 years in office, to combine continued military pressure with a genuine, if ultimately unsuccessful, effort at political conciliation, offering pardons to rebels willing to lay down arms and quietly shelving the hated 10th penny tax his own predecessor had tried to impose. Requeson's own moderation, whatever its own genuine merits, could not solve the one problem that had bedevilled every Spanish governor of the Low Countries since the war began: the chronic and worsening failure of Philip's own treasury to actually pay the soldiers doing the fighting. And when Requesens himself died suddenly in March of 1576, leaving the government of the Low Countries without any clear successor for months while Philip's own court in Madrid deliberated, the unpaid and increasingly desperate Spanish garrison, stationed in the citadel above Antwerp, found itself, for the first time in years, answering to no effective authority at all, a vacuum of command that made the mutiny and the massacre that followed only weeks later considerably more likely and considerably less surprising than it might otherwise have been. A city burned by its own defenders' mutiny, and a peace that could not hold. It is worth naming, plainly, the single most catastrophic episode to strike the wealthy southern city of Antwerp across this entire war, because it came not from a deliberate Spanish siege at all, but from a mutiny within Spain's own army, a consequence of the specific and chronic weakness that would, again and again across this long war, undercut even Spain's own most successful military campaigns. The simple, grinding failure of Philip's own treasury, drained by wars on half a dozen fronts across Europe and by a crown that had already defaulted on its own debts once in 1557 and would do so again in 1575 to actually pay its own soldiers on time. In November of 1576, several thousand unpaid Spanish troops, garrisoned in the citadel above Antwerp and owed months of back wages, broke discipline entirely and rampaged through the city itself over 3 days of killing and looting that contemporaries and later historians alike would remember as the Spanish Fury, burning several hundred buildings, sacking the city's own magnificent town hall, and killing, by most careful modern estimates, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 of the city's own civilian population. A massacre carried out not by any deliberate order from Alba's own successors in Brussels, but by soldiers of the crown acting entirely on their own account, seeking simply the plunder. Their own government had failed to pay them in wages, and it is worth naming honestly that this single atrocity, committed by Spain's own mutinous troops against a city that had not even joined the Northern Rebellion, did more to unite the 17 provinces, north and south, Catholic and Protestant alike, in shared horror and shared determination than almost any single act of deliberate Spanish policy had managed across the preceding decade. It is worth naming, too, that Antwerp's own catastrophe in 1576 was, unhappily, not the last time an unpaid Spanish garrison would sack a Low Countries city in exactly this manner, because the same pattern recurred at Maastricht in 1579, when Parma's own forces, having finally starved the city into submission after a long siege, allowed mutinous and unpaid troops to sack it regardless of its own surrender, killing several thousand more civilians in a massacre contemporaries came to call, with the same grim, running nomenclature, this account has already shown you the Maastricht Fury, a third instance of the exact same catastrophic failure of military pay and discipline that had already destroyed Antwerp. Proof, if any further proof were needed, that this particular Spanish weakness was structural and recurring rather than any single unfortunate accident. It is worth naming, too, the brief and remarkable moment of near-total Low Countries unity that the Spanish Fury produced, because within weeks of the massacre, representatives of nearly all 17 provinces, Catholic and Protestant, loyalist and rebel alike, gathered and signed, in November of 1576, an agreement known as the Pacification of Ghent, a genuinely extraordinary document in which the provinces pledged to set aside their own religious differences for the moment, to work together to expel the mutinous and unpaid Spanish and foreign troops from their own soil entirely, and to leave the final settlement of the religious question in Holland and Zeeland to be worked out later, an agreement that came closer than anything else in this entire war to reuniting the whole of the 17 provinces against Spain as a single body. And it is worth naming, honestly, exactly how briefly that unity actually lasted, because the underlying religious and political divisions the pacification had merely papered over reasserted themselves within only a few short years, undermined further by the arrival of a new and considerably more capable Spanish governor, Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, a nephew of Philip's own, who combined real military brilliance with a shrewd and patient understanding of exactly which grievances among the southern provinces' own predominantly Catholic nobility could be exploited to peel them away from their own Protestant northern neighbours. It is worth naming, too, the Governor Philip sent to the Low Countries in the immediate aftermath of the pacification of Ghent, his own illegitimate half-brother Don Juan of Austria, a man who arrived in Brussels in 1576 already one of the most celebrated military commanders in all of Christendom, having led the combined Christian fleet to a historic victory over the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Lepanto only 5 years earlier, and whose own brief and ultimately unhappy governorship of the Low Countries reveals a great deal about how thoroughly the war had already reshaped what was politically possible there by the late 1570s. Don Juan arrived hoping to pacify the provinces quickly through a combination of personal charisma and the terms of the pacification he was initially willing to accept, formally agreeing, in the Perpetual Edict of February 1577, to withdraw Spanish troops from the Low Countries entirely. But his own private ambitions, which several surviving contemporary reports and Don Juan's own recovered correspondence suggest, included a genuinely serious scheme to use a Spanish invasion force staged from the Low Countries to conquer England, depose Elizabeth, and marry the imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots, made both the States General and William of Orange himself deeply and correctly suspicious of his own true intentions, and Don Juan's own relationship with the provinces collapsed within months, dissolving into renewed open warfare that would drag on until Don Juan's own sudden death from typhus in October of 1578, only 2 years into a governorship that had begun with such widely celebrated promise, clearing the way for his own nephew, Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, already serving as Don Juan's own senior field commander, to take up the governorship in his place and begin the patient, methodical reconquest of the south. This story is already described, the split that made 2 countries out of one revolt. It is worth naming plainly the specific moment at which the 17 provinces, having briefly stood together after the Spanish Fury, finally and permanently divided along the line that would eventually become the modern border between the Netherlands and Belgium. Because in January of 1579, the largely Catholic southern provinces, worn down by Farnese's own patient diplomacy and genuinely alarmed by the increasingly radical Calvinist direction the rebellion was taking in the north, formed their own separate league, the Union of Arras, formally reconciling with Philip's own government in exchange for guarantees of continued Catholic worship and a restoration of their own traditional local privileges, while the northern provinces, Holland and Zeeland chief among them, joined by several other rebel territories, responded within weeks by forming their own rival league, the Union of Utrecht, a considerably looser and more decentralised federal arrangement under which each province retained its own sovereignty, its own laws and its own religious arrangements, bound together only for the shared purposes of common defence and foreign policy, a document later generations of Dutch historians would come to regard somewhat after the fact as the founding constitutional charter of what would eventually become the independent Dutch Republic, though no one signing it in the spring of 1579 actually understood themselves to be founding a permanent new nation rather than simply organising a more effective wartime alliance. It is worth naming, too, one single clause buried within the Union of Utrecht's own considerably longer and considerably more mundane text concerning shared defence and taxation, because Article 13 of the Union declared that every individual should remain free in his own religion, and that no one should be investigated or persecuted because of his own religion. A genuinely remarkable statement of principle for any European government to commit to paper in 1579, decades before anything resembling religious toleration had become the norm anywhere else on the continent, though it is worth naming, honestly, that the Union's own signatories understood and applied this clause considerably more narrowly in practice than its own words might suggest, treating it chiefly as a guarantee that individual conscience would not be forcibly examined, rather than as any promise of full and equal public worship for every faith, an ambiguity that would leave Catholics, in particular, formally tolerated in private but excluded from public office and public worship alike across the whole of the new republic's own history. A toleration real but never total, in a pattern this story is going to return to again before it closes. It is worth naming, too, that Catholics were not the only religious community the new republic's own toleration left in a genuinely ambiguous position, because the Anabaptists, and their considerably more organised and considerably more durable descendants, the Mennonites, who had spread through the Low Countries alongside Calvinism from the 1530s onward, held to a doctrine of adult baptism, strict separation between church and state, and, in the specific detail that mattered most to a republic fighting an 80-year war for its own survival, an unwavering refusal on grounds of conscience to bear arms or swear civil oaths of loyalty, a pacifism that had made them targets of brutal persecution under Charles V, whose own placards against Anabaptism produced some of the very worst executions of the whole pre-war period, and that continued to make them figures of real civic suspicion even within the tolerant Dutch Republic their own war helped create, since a state built and sustained by 80 years of continuous fighting found a religious community that would not fight for it, whatever else it might contribute in trade and craft, difficult to fully embrace, and it is worth naming honestly that the Mennonites' own eventual accommodation within Dutch society achieved gradually across the following century through a combination of quiet civic usefulness and the payment of a special exemption fee in place of military service, offers one further small proof of this account's own recurring theme, that Dutch toleration, whatever its own genuine and unusual generosity by the standards of the age, was always negotiated rather than freely given, and always came with its own quiet price attached. It is worth naming, too, the specific and genuinely ingenious physical form that Catholic worship actually took across the officially Protestant Dutch Republic once the fiercest years of the war had passed, because rather than face outright prohibition, Catholic congregations in cities like Amsterdam built and maintained Schilkerken, hidden churches, ordinary-looking townhouses that concealed, behind an unremarkable front door, a full and sometimes genuinely elaborate church interior built into the upper floors and attic space, an open secret every local authority knew perfectly well existed and chose. In the same spirit of pragmatic, profitable toleration, this account has already described running through the whole of Amsterdam's own commercial life, not to look at too closely so long as the congregation kept its own worship discreetly out of public view, and one such church called, in the plain and quietly moving language of the age, Our Lord in the Attic, still stands today in central Amsterdam, preserved as a museum, its own hidden pews and its own hidden altar open now to any visitor willing to climb the same narrow stairs, a persecuted congregation once climbed in genuine secrecy. It is worth naming too the considerably less dramatic but no less essential machinery through which the rebel provinces actually managed to keep an army in the field at all across these same desperate years, because armies, however brilliantly led, do not march or eat or hold their own discipline without regular pay, and the province of Holland, forced by the sheer emergency of the war to develop new methods of raising money considerably faster than the old feudal apparatus of scattered local taxes and one-time noble levies could ever manage, pioneered, across the 1570s and 80s, a system of public borrowing administered through receivers, officials empowered to sell interest-bearing bonds directly to the province's own merchants, guilds, and even ordinary prosperous townspeople. Bonds backed not by any single king's own uncertain promise, but by the collective, pooled credit of Holland's own assembled towns and their own tax revenue. A genuinely novel arrangement that let the rebel provinces raise money considerably faster and considerably more reliably than Philip's own crown, which depended for its own war financing on a small number of enormously wealthy Genoese and German banking houses willing to lend against the uncertain promise of silver fleets that took months to cross an ocean, and that a storm, a pirate, or a Spanish default could interrupt entirely. And it is worth naming plainly that this single structural difference, a poor but credit-worthy rebel republic, borrowing efficiently from its own citizens against a genuine full-faith backing, set against a nominally far wealthier empire perpetually starved of ready cash and forced into serial bankruptcy 1557, 1575, 1596, and again in 1607, did as much to determine the eventual outcome of this war as any single battle fought in it, because an army that mutinies for want of pay, as Spain's own army did catastrophically at Antwerp in 1576 and would go on to do at least half a dozen further times across the war's remaining decades, has already lost something no battlefield victory can fully repair. It is worth naming too the single most spectacular individual feat of Dutch war finance the whole of this conflict produced, because in September of 1628, a Dutch admiral named Piet Hein, commanding a fleet belonging to the recently chartered Dutch West India Company, intercepted the entire annual Spanish treasure fleet off the coast of Cuba and captured it whole, silver, gold, indigo, and cochineal, loaded across dozens of Spanish ships and bound for the very treasury that funded the Army of Flanders, a single haul so enormous that it alone financed a full year of the Dutch Republic's own war effort against Spain, and it is worth naming plainly that this single capture was possible at all only because Philip's own annexation of Portugal back in 1580, a decision this account has already named as one further distraction from the war in the Low Countries, had folded Portugal's own vast overseas empire and Portugal's own colonial shipping into a single combined Habsburg target, meaning that the same war this whole account has told you about tonight as a story of dikes and sieges in a small corner of northern Europe was, by its own final resumed decades, also being fought by proxy and at enormous profit to the Dutch companies chartered specifically to wage it across the Caribbean, the coast of Brazil, and the trading ports of Asia, a genuinely global reach no single person raising a flag over an undefended harbour at Brielle in 1572 could possibly have imagined. It is worth naming plainly the formal and genuinely radical political act through which the northern provinces finally made explicit what their own continued armed resistance had, in practice, already meant for years, because on the 26th of July, 1581, the States General of the rebel provinces issued a document known as the Act of Abjuration, formally declaring that Philip II had, through his own tyranny and his own violation of the ancient privileges he had sworn to uphold, forfeited his own right to rule over them, a document whose own central argument that a sovereign who systematically abuses his own subjects rather than protecting them breaks the mutual obligation binding ruler to ruled, and thereby releases his own subjects from their own duty of obedience, stands as one of the earliest and most fully articulated statements of contractual, rather than purely divine or hereditary, kingship anywhere in European political history, an argument that would, across the following 2 centuries, echo forward through English constitutional theory, and eventually, quite directly, through the American Declaration of Independence itself, a document whose own drafters were demonstrably aware of, and in places closely paralleled, the reasoning the rebel Dutch provinces had set down 2 centuries earlier. It is worth naming honestly that having renounced Philip, the rebel provinces spent the following several years in genuine and often embarrassing uncertainty over exactly who, if anyone, ought to replace him, because a republic without any monarch at all remained, to nearly everyone involved in 1581, a genuinely alarming and untested form of government, and the States General spent these years actively courting foreign princes to accept the sovereignty they had just taken from Philip, offering it first to Francis, Duke of Anjou, the younger brother of the King of France, an arrangement that collapsed in disgrace within 2 years after Anjou's own attempt to seize direct military control of Antwerp in 1583, an episode remembered ever after as the French Fury, was beaten back by the city's own outraged population, and then, after William of Orange's own death, to Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, a favourite of Elizabeth I of England who arrived in the Low Countries in the winter of 1585 at the head of an English expeditionary force and governed for roughly 2 years, with a combination of genuine military and financial support that the struggling rebellion badly needed, and a level of personal high-handedness and political incompetence that alienated the very merchant regents of Holland, whose own cooperation his governorship depended on, an alienation compounded in the very same winter by one of the more genuinely shocking scandals of the whole English intervention, because in January of 1587, 2 of Leicester's own English commanders, Roland York and William Stanley, betrayed the towns entrusted to their own garrison command, York surrendering the fort guarding Deventer and Stanley surrendering the town itself directly to Spanish forces in exchange for money and Spanish favour, a double betrayal that cost the rebel cause 2 strategically important positions in a single stroke, and that confirmed, in the eyes of the already suspicious Holland regents, every doubt they had ever harboured about handing their own military security over to English hands, an arrangement that similarly collapsed by 1587, leaving the rebel provinces to conclude at last, and by process of exhausting every other option, that they would simply have to govern themselves. It is worth naming plainly the specific and formal terms under which Elizabeth's own English intervention actually arrived, because in August of 1585, only weeks before Antwerp's own fall to Parma made plain how dire the rebel cause's own military position had become, Elizabeth signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, agreeing to send several thousand English troops and a substantial sum of money to support the rebel provinces in exchange for the right to garrison 3 fortified coastal towns, Flushing, Brielle and the fort at Rammekens, as collateral against the loan she was extending, an arrangement that placed English soldiers in permanent occupation of Dutch soil for the better part of the following 2 decades, and that turned England, for the first time in this long war, from a covert and deniable sponsor of sea beggar piracy into an open and formally committed belligerent against Spain. It is worth naming, honestly, that Elizabeth's own support for the Dutch cause, even once it became formal and open, remained calculated and deliberately incomplete throughout, because Elizabeth herself, a monarch who had spent decades of her own reign carefully avoiding exactly the kind of open, sustained continental war her own limited treasury could ill afford, supported the Dutch rebellion not out of any deep Protestant solidarity, whatever the religious language of the Treaty of Nonsuch claimed, but out of a hard-headed strategic calculation that a Spain permanently entangled in the Low Countries was a Spain considerably less able to threaten England directly, a calculation that made Elizabeth a genuinely reluctant and genuinely stingy patron, chronically late with promised funds and chronically resistant to Leicester's own repeated requests for more troops, a pattern of half-hearted foreign support. This account has already shown you the rebel Dutch grew painfully accustomed to across their own dealings with Anjou before Leicester, and would recognise again in France's own similarly calculated and similarly incomplete assistance in the decades that followed. It is worth naming too the single most famous individual casualty of this English intervention, the poet and courtier Sir Philip Sidney, mortally wounded by a musket shot to the thigh during a minor cavalry skirmish near Zutphen in September of 1586, and remembered in one of the most widely repeated anecdotes of the entire war as having refused a bottle of water offered to him as he lay dying, passing it instead to a wounded common soldier lying nearby with the words that the other man's own need was greater than his, a story that entered English literary legend within years of Sidney's own death, and that modern historians treat with the same careful scepticism this account applies to every such beautifully shaped deathbed scene, noting that the earlier surviving accounts of Sidney's own death do not actually include the anecdote at all, and that it appears to have been added in a pattern this whole night has shown you more than once already, sometime in the retelling that followed. English involvement in the Dutch War, worth naming plainly, fed directly into the wider Anglo-Spanish War that erupted openly in the same years, a conflict whose own single most famous episode, the failed Spanish Armada of 1588, sent to invade England itself and remove Elizabeth's own support for the Dutch rebellion once and for all, ended in catastrophic and storm-battered Spanish defeat. A disaster that further drained Philip's own treasury and further limited how many resources Spain could spare in the years that followed for actually finishing the reconquest of the rebel Dutch provinces that Parma's own campaigns had, by the middle 80s, come so close to achieving. A single shot in a stairwell, and the Empire's own bounty finally collected. It is worth naming plainly the single most shocking individual act of violence in the entire war, because on the 10th of July, 1584, in the city of Delft, William of Orange was shot at close range in the stairwell of his own residence, the Prinsenhof, by a young Burgundian Catholic named Balthazar Gerard, a fervent believer in Philip's own cause, who had spent months carefully working his way into William's own household under false pretences in order to get close enough to strike, and who was acting, quite explicitly, to collect a genuine and formally proclaimed reward Philip's own government had placed on William's head years earlier, 25,000 crowns along with a grant of nobility, offered openly in a royal ban issued in 1580 to anyone who would kill the man Philip's own proclamation branded a traitor and an enemy of the human race, making William of Orange, by the sober judgment of modern historians, the first head of state in recorded history to be assassinated with a handgun, and Gerard himself, captured within moments of the shooting, was subjected to a punishment of such deliberate and prolonged brutality across the following days, a sentence this account will not describe in the graphic detail several surviving Dutch trial records preserve, that even contemporaries sympathetic to the rebel cause recorded some private unease at its own severity. Before Gerard was finally executed, his own family, in a final and genuinely startling detail, actually receiving the reward money and the promised title from Philip's own government after his death, official confirmation, as plain as any single document in this whole war could offer, that the Crown had knowingly sponsored the killing from the very start. It is worth naming too the remarkable document William himself had published 4 years earlier, in 1580, in direct response to Philip's own royal ban placing a bounty on his head, a lengthy public self-defence known ever since as William's own apology, addressed not merely to the States General of the Low Countries but, quite deliberately, to the whole of Europe, a pamphlet William had drafted with the help of a French Huguenot minister, and had translated and printed simultaneously in Dutch, French, Latin and English for the widest possible distribution, in which William answered, point by point, every charge Philip's own ban had levelled against him, defended his own conduct across the preceding decade and a half of war, and in its own final and considerably more incendiary passages accused Philip personally of a long list of private crimes stretching back across his own entire reign. A pamphlet that stands as one of the most widely circulated and most carefully argued pieces of political self-justification produced anywhere in 16th century Europe, and part of a wider pamphlet wore this whole conflict fought alongside its own battles, printed broadsides and translated atrocity accounts, the Spanish fury's own horrors chief among them, circulating rapidly across Protestant Europe and feeding directly into what later English and Dutch writers would come to call the Black Legend, a body of printed and widely believed accusation, not entirely unfounded but considerably sharpened and exaggerated in the retelling, that painted Spanish rule everywhere in its own vast empire, in the Low Countries and in the Americas alike, as uniquely and characteristically cruel among the colonial powers of the age, a reputation this same war did as much as any single other event in European history to manufacture and to spread. It is worth naming, honestly, what William of Orange had actually accomplished by the time of his own death, because it is easy, looking backward from the eventual Dutch victory, to remember him chiefly as the war's triumphant founding father, when the truer picture is considerably more modest and, in its own way, considerably more admirable, a man who had personally commanded and personally lost most of the individual battles he ever fought, who had spent his own vast personal fortune into ruin funding a rebellion that came close to collapsing entirely on multiple occasions across the 17 years between his own first exile and his own assassination, and whose own single most enduring achievement was not any battlefield victory at all, but simply his own persistence, his own stubborn refusal to abandon the cause across defeat after defeat after defeat, and his own genuine and, for the period, genuinely unusual commitment to religious toleration as a matter of practical governance rather than mere convenient rhetoric, a commitment his own Dutch successors would honour imperfectly, and sometimes not at all, but that nonetheless left its own permanent mark on the political culture of the Republic, his death helped bring into being, and it is worth naming too, the song. Written in his own honour sometime during these same years, a ballad called the Wilhelmus, composed in William's own voice, its own 15 verses, in the particular and specifically Dutch literary flourish of the age, spelling out an acrostic of his own full name, Willem van Nassau, across their own opening letters, a song that would go on, across the following 4 centuries, to become the national anthem of the country his own death helped create, the oldest national anthem in the world still in continuous use today, a duke's patient reconquest, and the city that never came back. It is worth naming plainly exactly how effectively Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, exploited the chaos and grief that followed William's own assassination, because Parma had spent the years since 1579 methodically reconquering the southern provinces for Spain, city by city, relying less on the brute terror Alba had favoured than on a genuinely shrewd combination of overwhelming siegecraft and remarkably generous surrender terms, guaranteeing captured towns their own traditional privileges and a genuine amnesty in exchange for submission, an approach that peeled town after town away from the rebel cause across the middle 1880s with a speed Alba's own harsher methods had never achieved. It is worth naming too the genuinely unusual arrangement Philip settled on for governing the reconquered southern provinces once the fighting there had largely quieted, because in 1598 Philip, in one of the final acts of his own long reign, formally ceded sovereignty over the Spanish Netherlands to his own daughter, Isabella Clara Eugenia, and her own husband, Archduke Albert of Austria, a nominally independent Habsburg couple who ruled the south from Brussels as the archdukes across the following decades, a genuine if carefully limited devolution of authority that gave the southern provinces their own resident court and their own more locally responsive government for the first time since Charles V's own day, an arrangement Philip's own successors quietly folded back into direct Spanish control once Albert died without an heir in 1621, but one that, for its own 2-decade span, gave the reconquered South a rare taste of the same kind of local, resident rule its own rebel northern neighbour had fought an entire war to secure permanently. It is worth naming too exactly how Parma's own remarkable career actually ended, because the same king who had diverted Parma's own army into France against his own better military judgment continued, across the early 1590s, to order Parma back into French campaigning again and again, even as Parma himself argued, in increasingly urgent correspondence with Madrid, that every season spent fighting in France was a season the rebel Dutch provinces spent recovering ground in the north, and Parma, wounded during one of these same French campaigns, and worn down by years of relentless, uninterrupted command, died in December of 1592 still in France, still following Philip's own orders rather than his own considerably sounder instincts, a death that removed, at a single stroke, the single, most capable general Spain had fielded across the whole of this war, and that stands, alongside the earlier diversion this account has already described, as one further measure of how much the Dutch Republic's own eventual survival owed less to any single Dutch victory than to a Spanish king's own persistent inability to let his own best commander finish the one war that actually mattered most. Parma's own crowning achievement came in the Great Siege of Antwerp itself, which began in the summer of 1584, only weeks before William's own assassination, and dragged on for 13 months through one of the most technically ambitious siege operations of the entire 16th century, because Parma, unable to storm a city as heavily fortified and as well supplied by river access as Antwerp, instead ordered the construction of an extraordinary pontoon bridge across the river Scheldt itself, a structure nearly half a mile long, built on boats lashed together and reinforced with forts at either end, specifically to cut the city off from all relief by water, an engineering feat the besieged Antwerpers attempted unsuccessfully to destroy with a spectacular and genuinely innovative weapon of their own devising, a fire ship packed with gunpowder and shrapnel that Dutch engineers detonated against the bridge in April of 1585 in an explosion so massive it killed, by some contemporary estimates, several hundred Spanish soldiers in a single instant, and that nonetheless failed to breach the bridge completely enough to save the city, which finally surrendered, its own population starving and its own hope of relief exhausted, in August of 1585. It is worth naming plainly exactly what Antwerp's own fall actually cost the city, and by extension the whole of the southern Low Countries, because Parma's own surrender terms were, by the standards of this brutal war, genuinely generous, granting the city's own Protestant population a period of 4 years in which to either convert to Catholicism or leave with their own property intact, and it is worth naming honestly that a very substantial number of Antwerp's own merchants, bankers and skilled craftsmen chose to leave rather than convert, a migration of tens of thousands of people northward into the still rebel provinces that stripped the city of a very considerable share of its own commercial expertise and its own capital in a single sustained exodus, and Parma's own recaptured government, moreover, maintained the closure of the River Scheldt that rebel forces to the north had themselves imposed during the siege, a closure the Dutch Republic would go on to enforce deliberately for the following 2 centuries, specifically to strangle its own former rivals' access to the sea, a decision whose own consequences would echo forward across the whole of the war and beyond it, because Antwerp, once the wealthiest and most sophisticated commercial city in northern Europe, would not recover its own former stature for generations, its own trade, its own capital, and its own people redirected, by the deliberate policy of the very rebellion it had briefly joined, toward the ports of the rebel north instead. It is worth naming plainly exactly why Parma, having taken Antwerp and having spent the preceding several years reconquering the south with such evident skill, never actually pressed his own advantage further north into Holland and Zeeland, while the rebel cause still reeled from William's own assassination and its own military weakness. Because the answer lies not in any failure of Parma's own generalship, but in Philip's own decision, made in Madrid and not in Brussels, to divert Parma's own army and Parma's own attention away from the Dutch war entirely at exactly the moment it might have been won. Philip, having annexed the crown of Portugal to his own empire in 1580, and having committed across the following decade enormous resources first to preparing the Armada against England in 1588, and then to intervening directly in France's own vicious wars of religion on behalf of the Catholic League against the Protestant claimant Henry of Navarre, repeatedly ordered Parma to march his own veteran army of Flanders out of the Low Countries and into France instead, a diversion that gave the exhausted, disorganised rebel provinces in the north precisely the breathing room they needed to reorganise under young Maurice of Nassau's own emerging leadership. And it is worth naming honestly that several modern historians regard this single strategic decision, made by a king who never set foot in the Low Countries after 1559, and who was, by this point in his own reign, juggling commitments across half of Europe simultaneously, as the single most consequential Spanish blunder of the entire war, a moment at which the rebellion, by every reasonable military assessment, ought to have been finished, and it is worth naming briefly what became of Alba himself after Philip recalled him from the Low Countries in disgrace in 1573, because Philip's own confidence in his old general survived the Dutch failure considerably better than Alba's own reputation there ever would, and in 1580, at the age of 72, Alba was recalled from a bitter retirement to lead the Spanish conquest of Portugal, following Philip's own claim to that country's vacant throne, a swift and overwhelmingly successful campaign that added an entire second overseas empire to Philip's own crown within a matter of months, Alba's own last campaign proving in miniature the very same contrast this whole account has already drawn between the empire's own effectiveness against a conventional kingdom with a capital to capture and its own persistent generation-long failure against a decentralised, waterlogged rebellion that had no single capital worth marching on at all. It was saved instead by a king in Madrid who could not resist reaching for one more crown at exactly the moment his own hand needed to close around the one already closest to slipping from it. It is worth naming, too, exactly what this same war actually cost the ordinary population of Spain itself. A cost this account owes the same honest naming it has already given to the ordinary population of the Low Countries, because the crushing expense of maintaining the army of Flanders across 8 decades fell, in the end, not on some abstract royal treasury, but on the taxpayers of Castile, the Spanish crown's own most heavily and most reliably taxed territory, through a rising burden of direct taxation, and, more corrosively, through the Milones, a series of enormous emergency levies. The Spanish Parliament, the Cortes, was pressured into approving again and again across the turn of the 17th century specifically to fund wars in the Low Countries and elsewhere. A fiscal burden several modern economic historians point to as a genuine contributing cause of Castile's own long 17th century economic decline, a countryside gradually depopulated by military conscription and by emigration to the Americas, its own agricultural output stagnating even as its own tax burden climbed, so that the same war this account has shown you slowly enriching the rebel Dutch North was, across these same decades, quietly and considerably less dramatically impoverishing the Spanish South that funded the effort to crush it, a mirrored and largely invisible cost this account offers honestly precisely because it so rarely makes it into either country's own national memory of the war. It is worth naming, honestly, what actually became of the southern provinces once Parma's own reconquest had settled them back under Spanish rule. Because the story this account has told you so far has followed the war's own momentum steadily northward, and it would be easy to let the South simply vanish from the story the moment it stops fighting, when the truer picture is that the reconquered South entered, across these same years, a long and genuinely transformative program of religious reconstruction. The restored Habsburg government in Brussels, working closely with a newly energized Catholic Church determined to win back, through persuasion and education rather than the sword alone, the ground the Reformation had taken from it, invited the recently founded Jesuit order to establish schools and colleges across the southern provinces in numbers that would, within a generation, make cities like Antwerp and Leuven into genuine centres of counter-Reformation learning and art. A rebuilding project that produced, among a great deal else, the specifically Baroque religious painting of artists like Peter Paul Rubens, whose own enormous altarpieces, commissioned in no small part to replace the very religious imagery the Beeldenstorm had destroyed decades earlier, still hang today in the same Antwerp cathedral the iconoclasts once stripped bare. It is worth naming plainly that this same recatholicization was not achieved through education and art alone, because the southern province's own restored authorities maintained real and continuing legal pressure against Protestant worship for generations afterward, a considerably gentler pressure than Alba's own Council of Blood had applied, but pressure nonetheless, and it is worth naming honestly that the South's own economic fortunes never recovered. Across the whole of the following 2 centuries, the commercial primacy Antwerp alone had once held, a slower, quieter and less dramatic cost of this war than any single siege, but a cost that shaped the whole of the southern Low Country's own future all the same. A one-armed prince's brother and the 10 years that rebuilt an army from nothing. It is worth naming plainly the man who took up the military leadership of the rebel cause after William's own assassination, his own son Maurice of Nassau, only 17 years old at the time of his own father's death, a young man whose own eventual transformation into one of the most consequential military reformers in early modern European history could not have been predicted from his own age alone, and it is worth naming too the specific and genuinely important intellectual partnership through which that transformation actually happened, because Maurice worked closely, across the years of his own rise to command, with his own cousin, Willem Lodewijk, Stadtholder of the northern province of Friesland, and with a circle of humanist scholars steeped in the recently rediscovered military writings of ancient Rome, applying, with real and patient rigour, classical drill techniques and organisational principles to an army that had, until this point, relied largely on undisciplined mercenary companies of exactly the kind that had mutinied and sacked Antwerp only a few years earlier. It is worth naming, plainly, exactly what this military reform actually consisted of, because it amounted to nothing less than one of the genuine turning points in the whole history of European warfare, a set of innovations later historians would come to call the military revolution. Maurice's own reformed army drilled its own soldiers in standardized, repeatable movements, broke down the old massive infantry blocks of the period into smaller, more maneuverable and more flexible formations, insisted on regular pay delivered on schedule specifically to prevent the kind of mutiny that had destroyed Antwerp, and invested heavily and systematically in the specific engineering skills, siegecraft, fortification design, and the science of controlled flooding and drainage that the waterlogged terrain of the Low Countries had always rewarded, and that Maurice's own reformed army now studied and applied with a professional rigour no army in Europe had previously brought to it, innovations that would go on within a generation to be studied and copied by military reformers across the whole of Protestant Europe. It is worth naming, too, the single figure most responsible for turning Maurice's own battlefield instincts into a systematic, written body of engineering and mathematical theory, Simon Stevin, a Flemish-born mathematician and engineer who served for years as Maurice's own personal tutor and technical advisor, publishing treatises on fortification, on the mathematics of gunnery, and on the science of drainage and dike building that formalised, in careful, reproducible written method, a great deal of the practical expertise this whole story has already shown you. The Dutch had accumulated across generations of pure hydraulic necessity, and it is worth naming plainly that Stephen's own restless intellect ranged well beyond the immediate demands of the war he served, producing, among a great deal else, an early argument for decimal fractions and a working design for a wind-powered land yacht that reportedly carried Maurice himself and a party of guests along a Dutch beach at a speed contemporaries found almost frightening. A reminder that the same patient, practical, problem-solving temperament this whole account has described building dikes and winning sieges also produced, in the same period and often in the very same men, a considerable amount of genuinely original science. It is worth naming too the specific string of campaigns through which Maurice actually put these reforms into practice across the 1590s, a sustained decade of methodical, patiently prepared sieges that recovered, town by town, much of the territory Parma's own earlier reconquest had taken, beginning with the recapture of Breda in 1590 through a genuinely ingenious ruse in which a small force of Maurice's own soldiers concealed themselves inside a peat barge, making its ordinary delivery run into the town, emerging after dark to seize the gates from within, and continuing across the following years with the recapture of Zutphen and Deventer in 1591, the fortress towns of Steenwijk and Coevorden the same year, guarding the strategic northeastern approach to Groningen, and Nijmegen shortly after, before Maurice's own army finally completed the reconquest of the north in 1594 with the recapture of Groningen itself, the last major rebel town still under Spanish control. A siege that ended, fittingly enough for a story this account has told you again and again tonight, with the besiegers cutting the dikes surrounding the city to flood the surrounding countryside and force its own garrison surrender. A decade of steady, unglamorous, professionally executed reconquest that stood in almost complete contrast to his own father's earlier decades of costly improvised failure, and that established, by the close of the century, a genuinely defensible and genuinely coherent rebel territory in the north that Spain's own exhausted treasury, drained now by simultaneous wars against England and France as well, was proving increasingly unable to dislodge. It is worth naming too one further engagement from these same years that Maurice's own reformed army fought not as a siege, but as a pitched battle in the open field, a considerably rarer and considerably riskier form of combat that both sides had, for most of this war, preferred to avoid, because at Nieuwpoort on the coast of Flanders in July of 1600, Maurice's own army met a Spanish force under Archduke Albert directly, in a battle whose own outcome hung, for hours, in genuine doubt, before Maurice's own disciplined infantry and his own well-handled cavalry reserve finally broke the Spanish line, a rare open-field victory that nonetheless proved, in the end, strategically inconclusive, since Maurice, wary of overextending his own army so deep into hostile Flemish territory, withdrew rather than press the advantage, a decision some of his own contemporaries criticised, and that later historians have generally judged the more prudent course all the same. It is worth naming too the single longest and most punishing siege of the entire war, the Siege of Ostend, a fortified port town on the Flemish coast that Spanish forces besieged beginning in July of 1601 and did not finally capture until September of 1604, more than 3 full years later, an operation so costly in lives on both sides, by some contemporary estimates, as many as 100,000 soldiers killed across the whole siege between both attackers and defenders combined, though modern historians treat that particular figure with real caution, that the town came to be known across Europe, even while the siege was still underway, as the New Troy, and it is worth naming honestly, the genuinely bitter irony that sits at the centre of the whole 3-year ordeal, because by the time Ostend's own garrison finally surrendered what remained of a town reduced by years of bombardment to little more than rubble and mud, Maurice's own forces had already captured the nearby town of Sluis in a separate campaign, a strategic gain that left the Spanish capture of Ostend's own ruins looking, to more than one contemporary observer on both sides, like a victory scarcely worth the 3 years and the tens of thousands of lives it had cost to win. It is worth naming plainly the deeper technological reason why sieges like Ostend could drag on for years rather than weeks, because the medieval fortification this war inherited, tall, thin, vertical stone walls built to resist scaling ladders and battering rams, had been rendered almost obsolete across Europe by the widespread adoption of gunpowder artillery over the preceding century. A single well-placed cannonball capable of shattering a traditional medieval wall in a way no siege engine of the previous age ever could, and the Low Countries, forced by the sheer intensity and the sheer duration of this particular war to solve that problem faster and more thoroughly than almost anywhere else in Europe, became one of the leading laboratories for an entirely new school of military engineering. Low, thick, angled earthen ramparts faced with brick or turf rather than tall stone, arranged in the star-shaped bastion pattern that let defenders lay interlocking lines of cannon and musket fire across every possible approach to the wall. A design tradition, building on an earlier Italian innovation, that Dutch engineers refined so extensively across the war's own middle decades that later military historians came to call it simply the Old Dutch System, and that combined, in the specifically Dutch case this whole story has already shown you, with the deliberate controlled flooding of the surrounding countryside as a second and equally formidable line of defence, a fortress ringed by both bastion and inundation being, by the early 1600s, very nearly the hardest kind of target in the whole of Europe for any besieging army to actually crack, which is precisely why so many of the sieges this account has described, Haarlem, Ostend, Breda, dragged on for months or years rather than the days a medieval wall might once have held out. It is worth naming too the sheer scale this war eventually reached compared to the ragged handful of exiles who began it, because the small mercenary bands Louis of Nassau raised with borrowed money in the late 1560s rarely numbered more than a few thousand men at any one time, while the professionalised standing army Maurice had built by the opening years of the 1600s numbered, at its own peak strength, somewhere in the range of 50 to 60,000 soldiers under permanent Dutch pay, a force that, alongside the roughly comparable army Spain still maintained in the southern provinces across these same years, made the Low Countries, for the better part of the war's own middle decades. The single most densely militarized stretch of territory anywhere on the continent of Europe. An entire regional economy on both sides of the front line organized, in ways large and small, around the standing requirement of feeding, housing, and paying two of the largest permanent professional armies the early modern world had yet produced. A truce nobody quite trusted, and a statesman the Republic devoured. It is worth naming plainly the negotiated pause that finally, if only temporarily, halted the fighting after 4 decades of war, because in April of 1609, exhausted Spanish and Dutch negotiators concluded the 12 years' truce, an agreement that fell short of any formal Spanish recognition of Dutch independence, but that suspended hostilities entirely for the following 12 years, allowing merchants, farmers and cities on both sides of the front line a genuine and, for many of them, entirely unfamiliar stretch of uninterrupted peace. A truce that the rebel province's own leading statesman, a formidable Holland lawyer and politician named Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, had pushed for with real determination against the strong objections of Maurice and the House of Orange, who worried, correctly as it would eventually prove, that any pause in the fighting risked squandering hard-won military momentum and inviting a resurgent Spain to return once its own treasury had recovered. It is worth naming plainly exactly what kind of government the rebel provinces had actually built for themselves by the time this truce arrived, because it was never, at any point across this whole war, anything resembling a centralised modern state, but a loose federation dominated in practice by the single wealthiest and most populous province, Holland, whose own internal government rested in the hands of a narrow and largely self-perpetuating class of urban merchant families known as regents, men who sat on the closed town councils of Amsterdam, Leiden, Dordrecht and the other Holland cities, who elected one another to office in a system that answered to no broader popular vote at all, and who sent their own delegates to the States of Holland, the provincial assembly that in turn sent delegates to the wider States General representing all 7 united provinces, a structure of government so thoroughly built around the interests and the caution of merchant wealth that visiting foreign observers frequently struggled to understand how a state with no king, no standing aristocracy holding real political power outside the House of Orange, and no single individual clearly in charge of anything could function at all. And it is worth naming plainly that the 2 rival centres of power this same structure inevitably produced, the regents of Holland who controlled the money and the stadholder from the House of Orange who controlled the army, coexisted only ever in an uneasy and periodically violent balance, a tension that had already surfaced once in the executed Egmont and Horn's own earlier era, and that would surface again, with lethal consequences for Oldenbarnevelt himself, in the very crisis this story is about to describe. It is worth naming honestly that the truce years, whatever peace and prosperity they brought to Dutch trade and Dutch cities, also exposed and inflamed a genuinely bitter, internal, religious and political conflict that the war's own urgency had, until this point, largely kept suppressed, a dispute between 2 rival camps within the Republic's own dominant Calvinist church, the Remonstrants, who followed the more moderate theological teaching of a professor named Jacobus Arminius, and who found their own strongest political backing in Oldenbarnevelt and the merchant regents of Holland, and the counter-remonstrants, who held to a stricter doctrine of predestination, and who found their own strongest backing, tellingly, in Maurice of Nassau himself, a conflict that escalated across the years of the truce, from theological pamphleteering into outright political crisis, resolved, on the doctrinal question at least, at the Synod of Dort, a great church council convened over the winter of 1618 and 1619 that formally condemned the remonstrant position, and, commissioned in the same gathering, a single new, officially authorized Dutch translation of the entire Bible, directly from the original Hebrew and Greek rather than from any earlier Dutch version, a project called the Statenvertaling, the States Translation, that took the appointed scholars until 1637 to complete, and that became, once published, not merely the standard Bible of the Dutch Reformed Church, but one of the single most influential forces in standardizing the Dutch language itself across all 7 provinces' own considerable range of regional dialects, a book ordinary Dutch households across Holland, Zeeland, Friesland and every other province would go on reading from a shared common text for generations, doing for spoken and written Dutch something not unlike what the King James Bible, translated in the same decades, did for English, and resolved on the political question considerably more brutally when Maurice, having outmanoeuvred his own long-time political rival entirely, had Oldenbarnevelt arrested, tried before a special tribunal on charges of treason that rested on thin and largely political grounds, and beheaded in The Hague in May of 1619, a killing that stands alongside the earlier execution of Egmont and Horn this story has already described, as one further reminder that this revolution, like most revolutions, proved fully capable of consuming its own most accomplished statesmen once their own usefulness to the men holding actual power had run out. It is worth naming too exactly who attended the Synod of Dort that condemned Oldenbarnevelt's own Remonstrant allies, because it was not a purely Dutch affair at all, but a genuinely international gathering. Delegates invited from the Reformed churches of England, Switzerland, and several German territories sitting alongside the Dutch churchmen themselves, a council that produced, in its own final canons, the theological formulation later generations of Protestant seminaries would come to teach, in a considerably later English acronym, as the 5 points of Calvinism, a rigid and clearly bounded statement of doctrine that effectively expelled the more moderate Remonstrant position from the officially recognised Dutch Reformed Church for generations to come. And it is worth naming too the single most famous individual survivor of the same political purge that claimed Oldenbarnevelt's own life, the legal scholar Hugo Grotius, already, by 1619, one of the most respected jurists in Europe, who had backed Oldenbarnevelt's own Remonstrant faction, and was, in the aftermath of the same tribunal, sentenced to life imprisonment in the fortress of Loevestein rather than execution, and who escaped, in March of 1621, in a genuinely remarkable episode that reads more like an adventure story than sober history. Smuggled out of the castle concealed inside a large wooden chest, his own wife had been permitted to have carried in and out regularly on the pretence that it held nothing more than his own books, a chest the castle guards had grown so accustomed to hauling past without inspection that no one thought to check it on the one occasion it actually mattered, and Grotius, once safely across the border into the southern Netherlands and then into France, went on to write, across the following decades of his own exile, some of the founding texts of modern international law, a legacy this same revolutionary republic's own internal politics very nearly extinguished inside a prison cell before it had properly begun. It is worth naming too that Maurice's own concentration of power in these same years produced, within only a few more years, a genuinely serious plot against his own life, because in 1623 a group of young Remonstrant sympathisers, several of them sons of men Maurice's own purge had executed or exiled alongside Oldenbarnevelt, conspired to assassinate Maurice himself in revenge, a conspiracy discovered before it could be carried out, its own participants tried and in several cases executed, a plot this account names honestly because it shows how directly the political violence of 1619 fed a second generation's own grievance. The same cycle of execution and retribution this whole story has already shown you running through the deaths of Egmont and Horn, of William of Orange himself, and now of Oldenbarnevelt's own circle in turn. It is worth naming too the man who succeeded Maurice as stadtholder upon his own death in 1625, his own younger half-brother Frederick Henry, whose own considerably more conciliatory temperament and whose own marriage to Amalia van Solms, a lady-in-waiting whose own court at The Hague began, across Frederick Henry's own decades in power, to take on a genuinely princely style of ceremony and patronage that the plainer, more strictly republican habits of William and Maurice had generally avoided, marked a real and noticeable shift in how the House of Orange presented itself, a shift several modern historians read as an early and unmistakable step toward the more openly monarchical role the House of Orange would eventually come to occupy in the centuries after this war's own end. A painted surrender, and a prince who took the same city back. It is worth naming plainly exactly how and why the fighting resumed once the 12 years' truce finally expired in 1621, because neither side, in truth, had ever fully abandoned its own underlying war aims during the pause. Spain's own government under the newly ascended Philip IV, hoping the intervening years had weakened Dutch resolve and Dutch finances enough to make renewed conquest achievable, and the resumed war's own single most dramatic early episode came in the Great Siege of Breda, conducted across many months in 1624 and 1625 by the formidable Genoese-born Spanish general Ambrogio Spinola, a siege that starved the town's own garrison into surrender in June of 1625, and that would go on to become, quite apart from its own immediate military significance, one of the single most famous individual events of this entire war in the memory of later centuries, immortalized in a painting the Spanish court artist Diego Velázquez completed roughly a decade later, The Surrender of Breda, depicting Spinola receiving the town's own keys from its defeated Dutch commander with a courtesy and a formality that later generations of art historians have read as a genuinely deliberate act of Spanish propaganda, presenting even a Spanish victory as one of magnanimous, chivalrous restraint rather than the grinding, starvation-driven siege it actually was. It is worth naming too the considerably less famous but considerably more consequential sequel to Breda's own fall, because the Dutch Republic's own military leadership, now under Frederick Henry, Maurice's own younger half-brother, who'd succeeded to overall command upon Maurice's death in 1625, spent the following decade methodically recapturing the strategic ground the resumed war had cost, taking the fortress city of S-Hertogenbosch in 1629 after a siege whose own scale and engineering ambition rivalled anything Parma had attempted at Antwerp decades earlier, taking Maastricht in 1632, weathering a major Spanish counter-siege at Bergen op Zoom in 1622 that Ambrogio Spinola himself, fresh from his own celebrated victory at Breda, was forced to abandon after months of failure. A defeat that cost Spain dearly in both men and prestige, and that showed, only 3 years after the painted triumph at Breda, exactly how quickly this war's own momentum could still swing back the other way, and finally, in 1637, retaking Breda itself. This same town Spinola had won with such celebrated formality only 12 years before, a recapture that received, this time, no equivalent painting to commemorate it, and that stands nonetheless as one of the clearest single measures of exactly how far the military balance of this long war had shifted across the 4 decades since Maurice first began drilling his own reformed infantry, away from Spain and toward the Republic it had once seemed impossible that Spain could ever lose to at all. It is worth naming too a small and genuinely bittersweet detail that closes out Frederick Henry's own long service to this war, because Frederick Henry, who had spent more than 2 decades of his own life carrying forward the military recovery his half-brother Maurice began, died in March of 1647, only 10 months before the Treaty of Münster. He had spent so much of his own career fighting to make possible was finally signed, a fate he shared, in a smaller and stranger way, with William of Orange's own earlier failure to see any of this war's eventual outcome. 2 successive leaders of the same family, who each gave the greater part of their own adult lives to a cause neither one lived quite long enough to see formally won, a fleet destroyed at anchor, and the peace that finally arrived. It is worth naming plainly the single decisive naval action that effectively ended Spain's own capacity to seriously contest this war by sea, because in October of 1639, a large Spanish fleet assembled at genuinely ruinous cost to carry troops and treasure to reinforce Spain's own faltering war effort in the southern Low Countries, was intercepted in the English Channel by a considerably smaller Dutch fleet under Admiral Martin Tromp, who shadowed the larger Spanish force for days, husbanding his own limited gunpowder and waiting with a patience several of his own subordinate captains found genuinely difficult to share, for wind and position to turn fully in his favour. And when the Spanish fleet finally took shelter in the neutral English anchorage known as the Downs, off the Kentish coast, Tromp brought up Dutch reinforcements and, on the last day of October, attacked the anchored Spanish fleet in open defiance of England's own claimed neutrality, destroying or capturing the great majority of Spain's own ships in a single overwhelming engagement, a battle that effectively ended Spanish naval supremacy in northern European waters for a full generation, and that modern naval historians still regard as one of the more complete tactical annihilations of a major fleet in the entire age of sail. It is worth naming plainly exactly how this exhausted and increasingly one-sided war finally reached its own formal end, because by the 1640s, Spain's own government, now fighting not only the Dutch Republic, but a simultaneous and genuinely existential war against France, and a separate revolt in Catalonia and Portugal all at once, had neither the treasury nor the manpower left to sustain the fight in the Low Countries any further, and in January of 1648, as part of the wider general settlement known as the Peace of Westphalia, that was, at that same moment, closing the far larger and far bloodier 30 Years' War convulsing the German lands, Spanish and Dutch negotiators, after some 7 years of on and off negotiation that had begun as early as 1641, finally concluded a separate agreement, the Treaty of Münster, in which Spain formally and permanently recognised the full independence and sovereignty of the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, a recognition that arrived 76 years, almost to the season, after that ragged, homeless fleet of sea beggars had first drifted ashore at an undefended harbour called Brielle, with no plan beyond finding somewhere, anywhere, willing to let them land. It is worth naming, too, the specific and genuinely telling sticking point that very nearly derailed the Münster negotiations even after 7 years of talks and brought both sides this close to peace, because the Dutch delegation, representing a republic whose own merchant fleet had spent decades building trade routes to Asia and the Americas that Spain and Portugal had once claimed as their own exclusive preserve, insisted, as a non-negotiable condition of any final peace, that Spain formally recognise the Dutch Republic's own right to continue trading in the Indies and formally accept the continued closure of the River Scheldt this account has already named, a closure that kept Antwerp's own trade permanently diverted toward Amsterdam, and Spain's own negotiators, exhausted by decades of war and increasingly desperate to free the Crown's own remaining resources for the more immediately threatening war against France, ultimately conceded both points, a settlement that closed the book on this account's own long story of siege and rebellion, while simultaneously locking in place, for 2 further centuries, the exact commercial arrangement that had made Amsterdam rich and had kept Antwerp poor. Let us walk back, briefly, across the whole shape of this long war before this account turns to its own final reckoning, because it is worth holding the whole 76-year arc in view at once. It began, in the narrowest sense, with a petition of loyal noblemen in 1566, and the insult that gave them their own lasting name curdled within months into the iconoclastic fury of the Beeldenstorm, and drew down upon the whole of the Low Countries the Duke of Alba's own council of blood and the executions of Egmont and Horn that convinced the wavering nobility resistance was their only remaining option. It caught fire in earnest in the spring of 1572, when a homeless fleet of exiled beggars stumbled into an undefended harbour at Brielle, and set off a chain reaction of town after town declaring against Spain, a fire that survived Alba's own campaign of reprisal massacre at Zutphen and Naarden, the brutal fall and mass execution at Haarlem, and the desperate flooded relief of Leyden, and that very nearly consumed itself from within at Antwerp's own Spanish fury, before the brief, fragile unity of the pacification of Ghent gave way, within 3 years, to the permanent split between the Union of Arras and the Union of Utrecht that drew the border. This story has already shown you still exist today. It survived the loss of its own founding prince to an assassin's bullet in a Delft stairwell in 1584, survived Parma's own relentless and nearly successful reconquest of the south, and found, in a one-armed general's own teenage son, the patient military reformer who spent a full decade retaking siege by careful siege the ground the war had cost before an uneasy 12-year truce, shattered by its own internal religious politics and the beheading of the statesman who had negotiated it, gave way to 2 decades more of grinding warfare, a painted surrender at Breda and its own unpainted recapture 12 years later, a fleet annihilated at anchor in the Downs, and finally in a German city that had nothing whatsoever to do with the Low Countries, a treaty that took 76 years to write, and that recognised at last what those first ragged beggars at Brielle could never have known they were beginning. It is worth pausing briefly on the plain question of why, when all of this is finally laid out end to end, the vastly larger and vastly wealthier Spanish Empire actually lost a war it began, by any reasonable measure, fully expecting to win within a few short years. No single cause carries the whole answer, but this account has, across tonight's long telling, named most of the pieces that together do, a geography of water and reclaimed polder that rewarded defenders who had spent generations learning to manipulate it over an attacking army that had not, a Dutch system of public credit that could pay its own soldiers considerably more reliably than a nominally far richer crown, perpetually one silver fleet away from its own next bankruptcy, a fortification revolution that turned every well-sited Dutch town into a siege lasting months or years rather than days, and running through the whole of it, a Spanish king in Madrid who again and again diverted his own best generals and his own best armies toward England, toward France, toward whatever crisis felt most urgent on any given year, never quite willing to commit the full and sustained weight of his own empire to finishing the one war that would, in the end, prove to be the single most consequential loss of his entire reign. It is worth naming, too, how differently this same war is remembered today on either side of the old front line, because in the Netherlands the 80 Years' War occupies something close to sacred founding myth status, taught to every school child, commemorated in street names and museum halls, and a national anthem still sung at the opening of Parliament, while in Spain the same war occupies, by contrast, a comparatively minor place in national memory, one exhausting and ultimately unsuccessful theatre among the many simultaneous wars against England, against France, against the Ottomans in the Mediterranean that filled Philip II's own long reign, a lost war rarely taught with anything like the same weight as the Reconquista or the conquest of the Americas, and it is worth naming honestly that this asymmetry of memory is not an accident, but a fairly ordinary feature of how empires and the nations that escape them tend to remember the same shared war very differently, the birth of one side's own identity registering, on the other side's own ledger as little more than a costly and moderately embarrassing entry among many. Both hands held open at once. It is worth naming honestly that this war does not divide cleanly into heroes and villains, no matter how tempting the shape of a triumphant national founding story makes that division feel, because the rebel cause that eventually won produced its own atrocities alongside its own genuine sacrifices. The beggars who liberated town after town along the Holland coast in 1572, also murdering the Catholic clergy of Gorkum in a peat shed against their own prince's explicit written wishes. The same rebellion that would go on to build one of the more genuinely tolerant societies in 17th century Europe, nonetheless excluding Catholics from public worship and full civic participation across the newly independent republic for generations after independence, had actually been won. A toleration this story is described elsewhere as real, but never total, and a war that both sides increasingly came to fight as it dragged into its own second and third decades, less as a conventional military campaign than as a struggle in which the wholesale killing of civilians in a captured town, Haarlem's 1,700 executed defenders standing alongside Antwerp's several thousand civilians slaughtered by their own supposed defenders' mutiny, had become a tactic both sides increasingly expected and increasingly practiced against the other. It is worth naming too the case that can honestly be made for Philip II's own side of this long argument, because it is easy, from the vantage point of a nation that eventually won its own independence, to flatten Philip into a simple tyrant, when the considerably more complicated truth is that Philip, by the political and religious logic of his own 16th century world, genuinely believed himself the lawful, inherited sovereign of these provinces, faced with subjects who had, in his own eyes, broken a sacred oath of obedience and embraced a heresy that threatened not merely his own crown, but their own eternal souls, a conviction that made compromise feel, to Philip personally, considerably less like political pragmatism than outright spiritual betrayal. A conviction Philip carried with him to the very end of his own life, dying in September of 1598 in a small plain room at his own palace of the Escorial after a slow and genuinely agonizing final illness, gangrenous and bedridden for weeks, that he endured, by every surviving account of his own household, with the same disciplined, unbending religious composure he had brought to every other decision of his own reign, reportedly continuing to review state papers from his own sickbed nearly to the end. A death that closed out, at last, a reign of 42 years, across which the rebellion in the Low Countries had never once, from its own opening tremors in the 1560s to the king's own final breath, been fully extinguished. And it is worth naming, plainly, that a considerable number of the Spanish soldiers and commanders who fought this war across its own 8 decades, Parma chief among them, brought to it real professional skill, real personal courage, and, in Parma's own case at least, a genuine and often successful instinct for the kind of magnanimous surrender terms that saved lives. Alba's own harsher methods would have spent freely. A fairness this account owes to an empire this story has spent so much of tonight describing at its own most brutal. It is worth naming too that the soldiers who actually filled the ranks of Spain's own army of Flanders across these 8 decades were, for the great majority of their own number, not the fanatical instruments of royal and religious will that Dutch wartime propaganda, understandably enough, generally made them out to be, but Italian, German, and Walloon mercenaries and conscripts fighting, in the great majority of cases, for the same unglamorous reasons soldiers in almost every early modern army fought: a wage, however unreliably paid, and whatever plunder a captured town might yield when that wage failed to arrive; men whose own mutinies, Antwerp's own catastrophe, chief among them, arose considerably more often from simple unpaid desperation than from any coordinated religious or political design. And it is worth naming plainly that a considerable number of the soldiers fighting on the rebel Dutch side across these same decades were themselves foreign mercenaries too, English, German, French, and Scottish volunteers and paid regiments serving in Dutch pay, for reasons that range from genuine religious sympathy with the Protestant cause to the same plain economic necessity that motivated so many of the soldiers on the opposing side. A reminder, this account offers honestly that the simple, comforting picture of Dutch patriots defending their own native soil against a purely foreign army was never, at any point across this long war, entirely true on either side of the front line. It is worth pausing too on how much of this long war's own outcome turned on chance rather than on any inevitable historical logic, because it would be easy telling the story backward from an independent Dutch republic that did eventually exist, to imagine that outcome as somehow written in advance, when the plainer truth is that this war could very easily have ended differently at several distinct and genuinely fragile moments. Had the wind at Leyden failed to turn when it did, in October of 1574, the relief fleet could not have crossed the flooded polders in time, and the city's own final surrender, after so many months of starvation, would very likely have followed within days. Had Philip chosen, at any point across the 1580s, to let Parma finish the reconquest of Holland and Zeeland, rather than diverting his own best army and his own best general toward England and France in turn, the rebellion's own fragile military recovery under the young Maurice of Nassau might never have had the years of breathing room it actually needed to happen at all. Had a single Burgundian assassin failed to talk his own way close enough to William of Orange in a Delft stairwell in July of 1584, the war's own already fractured rebel leadership might have held together considerably better across the difficult years that followed than it actually did without him. None of this is offered tonight to diminish the genuine courage or the genuine suffering of the people who actually lived through this war, but to hold, honestly, alongside their own courage, the plain fact that courage alone rarely wins a war of this length, and that a great deal of what later generations came to remember as inevitable Dutch destiny was, at the time, simply an unusually long and unusually lucky run of decisions, weather, and distraction breaking again and again in one particular direction rather than the other. The uncounted dead, and what the record cannot tell us. It is worth naming honestly that no confident total death toll for this entire 76-year war has ever been established, and almost certainly never will be, because the surviving records, scattered across town chronicles, garrison pay ledgers, and the occasional foreign ambassador's letter home, were never designed to produce anything resembling a comprehensive accounting, and the war's own casualties, moreover, extended considerably beyond the battlefield deaths and siege massacres this story has already named, into the far larger and far less documented toll of disease, displacement, and economic ruin that swept through town after town, whose own name never made it into any surviving chronicle at all. Entire rural populations along the shifting front lines, uprooted more than once across the decades, crops burned deliberately on both sides in the kind of scorched earth campaigning this war practiced as routinely as any siege, and it is worth naming plainly that the refugees this war produced, Antwerp's own tens of thousands who fled north rather than convert chief among them, rarely appear in the surviving record as anything more than a passing demographic footnote, a mass migration whose own individual griefs, the specific houses abandoned, the specific trades interrupted, the specific families split permanently between a Catholic South and a Protestant North, simply never made it into any ledger anyone thought to keep. It is worth naming too that of all the ways this war actually killed people, the single largest killer across the whole of its own 76 years was almost certainly neither the musket nor the sword but disease, because the crowded, unsanitary conditions of any besieged town, and the equally crowded and equally unsanitary conditions of any early modern army camp, provided exactly the circumstances that dysentery, typhus, and recurring outbreaks of plague needed to spread fastest and kill most efficiently. A pattern this account has already shown you in miniature at Tripolitza and at Ostend, but that held true, in some degree, at nearly every siege this whole story has described. Soldiers and civilians alike dying in numbers that never made it into any battle's own official casualty count, because a body found cold in its own bed a week after a bombardment ended does not appear in the surviving record as a casualty of the war that plainly killed it all the same. It is worth naming too how we actually know the story this account has told you tonight, because the war's own surviving contemporary chroniclers wrote, without exception, from inside one side's own perspective or the other, the Dutch historian Emmanuel van Meteren compiling, from his own vantage point as a merchant living in the exile in London, one of the earliest and most influential rebel-sympathetic accounts of the war while it was still being fought, and the Dutch chronicler Peter Bohr producing, across the early 1600s, an enormous and considerably more documentary history built from collected pamphlets, official correspondence, and eyewitness testimony that modern historians still rely on heavily, despite its own clear rebel sympathies, while the war's own Spanish and Catholic chroniclers, writing from within Philip's own court and within the reconquered southern provinces, told a considerably different story of loyal subjects betrayed by heretical rebellion. Two traditions of record-keeping that modern historians must read carefully against one another, aware of each one's own blind spots and each one's own loyalties, in order to reconstruct anything resembling the fuller and more honest picture this account has tried to offer you tonight. It is worth naming too that modern historians themselves do not entirely agree on how to name, or even how to count, the war this account has just described, because the term 80 Years' War, the name this whole account has used tonight, only became the standard label generations after the fighting ended, a tidy round number that smooths over the genuinely awkward 12-year gap the truce cut through the middle of it. And a number of contemporary historians prefer to speak instead of two related but distinct wars, an earlier revolt running from 1568 to 1609 and a later, resumed conflict running from 1621 to 1648, joined by a genuine peace rather than a single continuous struggle, a genuinely reasonable scholarly disagreement this account has chosen, for the sake of the story it wanted to tell you tonight, to set gently aside treating the whole 76-year span, truce included, as a single long argument over who would govern the Low Countries, because the underlying argument itself, whatever the fighting's own actual rhythm, never really stopped from Brielle to Münster, a border still drawn along an old religious line and an anthem still sung. It is worth naming plainly exactly how directly the outcome of this 76-year war continues to shape the map of Europe that exists today, because the line the Union of Utrecht and the Union of Arras drew between North and South in 1579, a line drawn originally along religious and political fault lines that had almost nothing to do with language, geography, or any coherent sense of national identity, hardened across the following centuries, first into the border between the independent Dutch Republic and the Spanish, and later Austria-Netherlands, and eventually, after further centuries of its own complicated history, into the modern border between the Netherlands and Belgium that still runs, in its broad outline, remarkably close to where Parma's own reconquest happened to stop in the 1580s, a border this story has just spent an entire long night explaining, drawn not by any careful modern survey of language or culture, but by the accidents of which towns a Spanish siege train happened to reach before its own campaigning season ran out. It is worth naming, too, one further and considerably more consequential inheritance of this same 76-year war, because the southern provinces that reconciled with Spain in the Union of Arras in 1579 never rejoined their own northern neighbours, even after Spain's own power in Europe finally faded across the following century, remaining instead under Spanish, and later Austrian, Habsburg rule until Napoleon's own army swept through at the very end of the 1700s, and then passing, after Napoleon's own defeat, into a brief and uneasy reunification with the North as a single kingdom of the Netherlands, a reunification that lasted barely 15 years before the same old religious and cultural fault line this war first cut across the map, in 1579 reopened, in 1830, into the revolution that created the modern, independent Kingdom of Belgium, a nation whose own existence, whatever else can be said of the complicated politics that actually produced it, traces its own deepest root back to a delegation of frightened noblemen deciding, in a single winter, that reconciliation with Spain felt safer than continued war beside their own Calvinist northern neighbours. It is worth naming too the specific colours the rebel forces carried into battle across this whole war: orange, white and blue drawn from William of Orange's own personal heraldry, and flown from Sea Beggar ships from the earliest days of the revolt onward, colours that would, over the following centuries, gradually shift in their own official shade from orange to the modern red that appears on the Dutch national flag today, a change modern flag historians attribute to orange dye's own tendency to fade and darken with age and exposure to salt air aboard a ship, rather than to any deliberate political decision, even as the original orange itself never disappeared from Dutch life at all, surviving instead as the colour of the Dutch royal house directly descended from William's own family, and as the colour, to this day, that the whole of the Netherlands still wears in the streets, on flags, and on national television every time its own football team takes the field. It is worth naming too the small, quiet ways this same war still surfaces in the ordinary, everyday texture of the modern Netherlands, because the Wilhelmus, the song written in William of Orange's own voice sometime in the 1570s or 80s, is still sung today, in full or in part, at the opening of the Dutch Parliament, and at national commemorations, the oldest national anthem on earth still in continuous official use, and the word guzen, beggars, the insult a single dismissive Spanish courtier threw at a delegation of loyal, petitioning noblemen in 1566, is still used today, in the modern Netherlands, as a term of quiet, affectionate national pride, evoked especially in memory of the Dutch resistance to a much later foreign occupation in the 1940s, a 4th-century echo of the same particular stubborn Dutch habit this whole story has shown you again and again, the habit of taking an insult meant to shame them and wearing it, instead, as a badge. It is worth naming too a small handful of further, quieter places where this same war still lingers in plain sight for anyone who goes looking for it. William of Orange himself lies buried today in the Nieuwe Kerk in Delft, only a short walk from the Prinsenhof stairwell where he was shot, in an elaborate marble mausoleum completed decades after his own death that has since become the traditional burial place of the whole House of Orange-Nassau. The same royal family that still, in an unbroken line traceable directly back to William's own descendants, occupies the throne of the modern Netherlands today. The civic militia companies this war forced every Dutch town to organise and maintain for its own defence, the schutterie, outlived the war itself by generations, gradually transforming from a genuine wartime necessity into a ceremonial and social institution whose own group portraits, commissioned by the militia companies themselves as a mark of civic pride, became one of the defining genres of the whole Dutch Golden Age of painting. The single most famous example, Rembrandt's own Night Watch, completed in 1642, only 6 years before the Treaty of Münster finally ended the war. Those same civic guards had spent generations preparing to fight, still hanging today in Amsterdam as one of the most visited paintings in the world. And the towns whose own suffering this story has tried honestly to name, Naarden above all still hold, to this day, an annual commemoration of the massacre this account described earlier tonight, a candle-lit remembrance held every few years in the very church where Spanish troops once herded the town's own population before setting it alight. A 450-year-old grief the town has chosen deliberately not to let fade into mere historical footnote. That brings us to the end of our long story tonight, of a war that began, as so many of the longest wars in human history do, not with any single grand design, but with a handful of homeless, half-starved exiles taking shelter in an undefended harbour, because they had nowhere else left to go, and that ended 76 years and untold thousands of uncounted dead later, with an empire that had once ruled from the tip of South America to the Spice Islands of the Pacific formally kneeling at a negotiating table in the German city of Münster to acknowledge that a strip of wet, flat, resource-poor land at the mouth of a few northern rivers now belonged, by right and by law, entirely to itself. It is a story, in the end, less about any single battle or any single hero than about the sheer, grinding, unglamorous persistence of ordinary people, farmers who broke their own dikes rather than surrender, sailors who turned a stranger's insult into a nation's own proudest name, a prince who lost nearly every battle he personally fought and never once stopped trying. And it asks us, gently, to sit for a moment tonight with the plain, quiet truth that most of the freedoms any of us now take for granted were won not in a single clean and glorious moment, but in exactly this way, slowly, expensively, unevenly, by people who could not have known, in the middle of the losing, that they were eventually going to win. Thank you sincerely for spending this long, quiet stretch of the night here with this story. If it kept you company through these small hours, consider leaving this channel a like or subscribing if you would enjoy more of these long, unhurried histories finding their way to you. And remember, if you're watching on YouTube, the Spotify link waiting in the description if you would like to hear the next one early. And if you found your way here from Spotify instead, Historian at Midnight is waiting for you on YouTube too. Whatever weight you carried into tonight, let it settle now, a little lighter than it was, smaller, perhaps, than a war that took 76 years to end. Close your eyes, let the rest of the night take care of itself. Good night and sweet dreams.